The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Again, good morning to everyone and welcome to today's hearing on the rise in violence against minority institutions. I would like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list to circulate exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. Your vital information is important to the historical record of this committee hearing. I would also ask all members to please mute your microphones when you're not speaking to the hearing's business. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's hearing on the rise in violence against minority institutions will continue this subcommittee's inquiry into domestic terrorism and investigate the rise in attacks directed against minority institutions and places of worship across the nation. For too many years now, every ethnic group in the United States has been touched by the increase in domestic terrorism and hate crimes, many in the tragic form of mass shootings. I know that if I opened up this moment to members, each of my members on this committee might cite some incident in their community. Just recently in Harris County, northeast of Atascocita and northwest Cyprus, anti-Semitic and racist messages were posted at the doors of homeowners. It's everywhere. These tragedies and their circumstances are all too familiar to each of us. The shooting spree at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, which left 22 dead and 24 more injured. The rampage at Philadelphia's Tree of Life Synagogue, where 11 people were killed. The racist attack on the Sikh temple of Wisconsin, which left 6 people dead. The brutal murder of 9 worshipers in the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. 3 Muslim college students executed in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, supposedly over parking, but tinged with hostility to the young people's look. And the spa shooting in Atlanta killed 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent. In each instance, the perpetrator had previously espoused racist and xenophobic beliefs against minorities. Last year, this subcommittee held a hearing on the rise of domestic terrorism in America to discuss the surge of white supremacy and right-wing extremism, and to discuss federal law enforcement's failure to address domestic terrorism and acts of violence driven by racially motivated hate and, of course, animus toward religious minorities. It appears that trends have not changed and the rise in violence continues. Once again, we watched in horror on January 15th of this year as a gunman stormed into a synagogue, this time in Colleyville, Texas, taking 4 people hostage and holding them for almost 12 hours. Miraculously, and in part due to training the congregation received following other anti-Semitic attacks, those who were held hostage managed to escape, including under the leadership of their rabbi. Then, as Black History Month began, more than 20 historically Black colleges and universities across the country became the targets of repeated bomb threats, even starting as early as January, which paralyzed these vital institutions of higher education, disrupting learning by forcing them to suspend classes, striking fear in the hearts of young students, faculty and staff, parents, and the communities that surround and support them, reopening wounds of those who recall the threats, bombings, burnings, and lynchings of the not too distant past. We have to take these threats to young people and institutions of learning, minority institutions, very, very seriously. Because what is a threat can become devastation tomorrow. What is a threat today can become devastation tomorrow. The threats, which began in January, including at Prairie View A&M University, not far from my district in Prairie View, Texas, intensified in frequency in February, and the number of schools targeted grew in number by the day. Howard University, which sits not far from this nation's capital, have received at least 5 bomb threats in the past 2 months, the most recent being communicated on Monday. This is unacceptable. At least one caller claimed to be affiliated with a violent neo-Nazi group known to have participated in the racist Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, which resulted in the barbaric death of Heather Heyer. Both the FBI and ATF are currently investigating the bomb threats, as they should, which limits the amount of information we can receive or discuss. However, we do know these crimes are being investigated as racially motivated, and we look to soon having full investigations by both the FBI and the ATF. Threats of violence and intimidation against minority institutions are intended to incite fear and anxiety among diverse communities, are deeply rooted in the fabric of the United States history. Let it be very clear that attacks on students and institutions are attacks on communities and families and surrounding areas. In the turbulent years of post-Civil War Reconstruction, at least 2,000 Black people were lynched, along with thousands who were harassed, beaten, and threatened simply because they chose to live as they should as free men and women. When Reconstruction ended, Southern states regained control of their governments and enacted Jim Crow laws that legalized discrimination, with many elected officials being members of the Ku Klux Klan, making white supremacy the law of the land. During this same period, Chinese immigrants endured hateful acts of racism as white workers began to see them as competition, first for gold and later for scarce jobs. Racism and xenophobia against Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, led to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which banned Chinese laborers from entering the United States for 10 years and prohibited Chinese immigrants already here from becoming citizens. By 1924, the United States had taken steps to shut down nearly all immigration from Asia and to enact a quota system that severely restricted immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Klan maintained its anti-Black doctrines, added to its vile rhetoric, anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic tenets, all in the name of white supremacy and racial purity. The Klan maintained a strong foothold in politics and continued harassing and killing African Americans with impunity. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, more than 4,084 racially motivated lynchings occurred in 12 Southern states between 1887 and 1950. As African Americans struggled for equal rights under the law, the Klan murdered and threatened civil rights workers, bombed churches, and beat and spat upon nonviolent protesters like Congressman John Lewis and the Freedom Riders. By 1975, Klan members had bombed almost 70 buildings in Georgia and Alabama, burned 30 Black churches in Mississippi, murdered 10 people in Alabama. Sadly, the views and acts of hate committed by white supremacists reverberate throughout American history. We still hear their echoes today as men holding tiki torches march and chant, "Jews will not replace us." When members of the Proud Boys, a far-right organization identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group and classified by the FBI as having white nationalist ties, burned Black Lives Matter flags in front of 2 historically Black churches in the nation's capital, we remember the burning crosses placed in yards as warnings. And when young Black scholars are threatened with the possibility of bombings, we remember 4 little girls who died when their church, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, was bombed in 1963. These racist beliefs of the past are taking hold and again threatening our places of refuge and safety, such as HBCUs, churches, synagogues, and temples, which renewed fervor in the new ways. We cannot allow this to continue. Extremist ideology is not abstract danger. It harms Americans from a wide swath of backgrounds, including our frontline law enforcement officers, and we never know when or where it will strike again. We salute their service, especially those who made the ultimate sacrifice in keeping our communities safe from domestic extremist terrorism. And we're reminded of January 6th and the brave law enforcement officers who stood the guard to protect us, to protect the United States, and protect the citadel of democracy. FBI Director Christopher Wray declared that 2019 was the deadliest year for domestic extremist violence since the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. In 2020, the FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Program reported 8,263 hate crimes, including 11,129 offenses. Of these incidents, 62% were motivated by racial or ethnic bias, 20% were motivated by bias against person's sexual orientation, 13% were motivated by victims' religion. However, the FBI's reporting of hate crimes is thought to be a severe undercount since it relies on local law enforcement to voluntarily submit data, we must do better to collect the data and act upon it. The federal government possesses vast statutory authorities and resources to prevent attacks, prosecute those who commit them, fortify targeted institutions from further attacks, and arm citizens with the knowledge of how to protect themselves. Yet we are failing the American people who do not do more to face this threat. The Bipartisan Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, of which I'm a co-sponsor, is one measure that would strengthen the federal government's effort to respond to domestic terrorism. This legislation would authorize the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and the FBI to analyze, investigate, monitor, and prosecute domestic terrorism jointly, promote information sharing among federal law enforcement agencies, and take preventative measures, focusing federal resources on the most significant threats. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished guests, witnesses who will speak directly to the continuing violence, threats of violence, and trauma being inflicted upon minority communities across this country. Fear cannot be an option in this nation. Healing must be. We must bring people together, and we must pass legislation here in the United States Congress to be signed by the president that helps to heal the nation and protect the nation as well from the scourge of domestic terrorism. I hope that our discussion today will lead us to solutions that address the deficiencies in our domestic terrorism strategy to keep all Americans race. We must get to the bottom of racial antagonisms and as well as religious antagonisms and others that keep us separated. Without objection, I will submit into the record the following documents: an op-ed by our colleague, Congressman Kwesi Mfume, entitled "Terrorists Won't Stop Our HBCUs." Representative Mfume is an alumnus of Morgan State and also represents Morgan State, which sits in his district. He has also served as chairman of the Board of Regents at the university for over a decade and has expressed to me his deep concern for the attacks on HBCUs and has really contributed in his request to this hearing. We thank him very much for his leadership and we look forward to working with him, even though he's not a member of this committee. A joint letter from the United Negro College Fund and the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, written testimony from the Muslim Advocates, a letter from the American Council on Education, a letter from the National Action Network. We'll have all of these submitted into the record without objection. I now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Owens, for his opening statements. Mr. Owens, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson Lee and Chairman Nadler and Ranking Member Biggs. Thanks for the opportunity for me to share my statement this morning. I have to apologize in advance. I have to leave early, so I want to thank the witnesses now for their participation. The violent crime rate in America is rising, and that is simply not acceptable. Americans of all races, classes, and socioeconomic conditions have been affected. Too many Americans are scared and worried about their safety and that of their children, neighbors, and our law enforcement officers. So while the increase in violence against historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, are concerning, and I will add, the increase in violence against Asian Americans, Jewish Americans, and police officers are also concerning. It's puzzling to me that we as a crime subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee aren't doing more to examine this frightening increase in violent crime. My first point is that this overall rise in crime has killed or harmed more minorities and Black Americans than the unfortunate bomb threats at the HBCUs. According to a new study by the University of California, Davis, the recent rise in violent crime across the United States has been concentrated in low-income communities of color, which have also been disproportionately experienced the impact of school closures during this pandemic. To further illustrate this point, that violence in America harms minority communities, I request unanimous consent to submit for the record a recent Wall Street Journal article entitled "Black Children Lives Matter Too" by Sylvia Bennett Stone. Ms. Bennett Stone is a Black mother whose 19-year-old daughter, Crystal, was killed by a stray bullet in 2004 after she made the fatal decision to stop and fill a car with gas. As Ms. Bennett Stone says, too many communities throughout our nation have become like war zones. My second point, violent crimes is harming all classes of Americans throughout our country. In the last few years, hate and violent crimes have increased against African Americans, Asian Americans, and Jewish Americans. And I must say at this point, something very concerning to me is that we're finding that the majority of Asian Americans' attacks are being done by Black Americans. So hate is hate, no matter what color the perpetrator is, and we have to figure out a way to stop this. Overall, FBI data for 2020 points to 25% increase in murders from the previous year, and the largest increase since the FBI began keeping these records in 1960. Quite simply, violent crime is spiking. Here are some headlines from the last 48 hours highlighting this problem. New York City seeing spike in violence against Asian Americans, Yahoo News. 35-year-old woman stabbed to death in Manhattan apartment in seemingly random act, ABC News. By the way, the victim in this crime was an Asian American. Seattle mayor calls for more police with violent crime hitting highest in 14 years. Status quo is unacceptable, Fox News. Again, it's no wonder that Americans of all races, classes, and socioeconomic situations are concerned. My third and final point is that the solutions to our crime problems will require input and help from across the board, including families, communities, and institutions of faith, but the solutions must include respect for our law enforcement officers. Instead of shoring up our law enforcement officers and solving recruitment and pay problems, we have members of this committee who have called for defunding the police. Here are a few statistics about the heroic efforts of our police officers. According to the FBI, 59 officers have been killed in the line of duty between January 1st and September 30th of 2021. This marks a 50% increase in the number of police officers killed when compared to the same period the previous year. Again, according to FBI records, nationally, 60,105 law enforcement officers have been assaulted while performing their duties in 2020. This represents an increase in 4,000 assaults from the previous year. Just last month, January 2022, over 30 police officers were shot and 5 killed in the United States. This is a 67% increase from last January. Madam Chairwoman, I repeat, the threats of violence at HBUs are concerning, but we are ignoring the bigger problem. Congress must do its part in addressing this spike in crime. I therefore call on the committee to hold hearings on the following topics: the correlation between defunding the police and the spike in violent crimes, the problems of law enforcement leaving the profession and violent attacks on police, and finally, the number of children who were killed by violence in their neighborhoods. According to NPR, over 1,000 children were killed or injured by gunfire in 2021. As I mentioned numerous times before this committee, my dad taught at an HBCU, Florida A&M in Tallahassee for 40 years. I'm concerned about anything that negatively impacts our institutions of learning. This national crime spike is impacting every institution and families of every background. Unfortunately, poor Black families are disproportionately bearing the brunt of this evil. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman.
Madam Chair, may I ask my friend Mr. Owens a question?
Yes.
Mr.
Yes.
Cohen, would you
Please do.
restrain so that we can allow Mr. Nadler to give his testimony?
I think it's pertinent that we ask this question at this point.
Madam
Owens
Chair,
said that-
point of order. We're still in,
Biggs.
thank you, Madam
Mr.
Chair.
Biggs.
Thank you. My point of order is this: we're in the opening statement phase of this committee hearing. It's not appropriate for members to then question other members about their opening statements. If he wishes to, if the gentleman from Tennessee wishes to ask a question, Mr. Owens, I respect that. I know Mr. Owens is willing to answer that question, but it would be more appropriate.
Point of order, Mr. Biggs.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Cohen, if you would be kind to indulge us to allow the opening statements at this time.
I yield, but I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen.
Thank
The
you.
chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Domestic terrorism is at its highest level since the FBI began tracking it in 1994. 10 years ago, a domestic terrorist killed 7 Sikh Americans in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. 5 years ago, militia members bombed a mosque in Bloomington, Minnesota. Last summer, a gunman killed 6 people of Asian descent at a spa in Atlanta. Last month, a gunman took 5 Jewish Americans hostage in their Texas synagogue. Just days ago, 17 of America's prized historically Black colleges and universities were locked down by bomb threats. Now, when we take stock of these horrific crimes, and when we consider the impact of this violence on the survivors, it can be tempting to give way to despair. At base, domestic terrorism isolates us, not just by inflicting violence in our communities, but also by defining individuals who are members of those communities as other. Domestic terrorists want to force us into that frame. a narrative of us and them. That narrative has cost us so much in recent years, but recent events have also taught us a great deal. Among other lessons, when it comes to fighting back against this sort of violence, we are all in the fight together. Three of our witnesses today are leaders in the communities I just mentioned, and I'm grateful they are here to share their experiences. By testifying today, you help to ensure that this committee and the American people understand the unseen impact of domestic terrorism, of hatred on our families and communities. And all of our panelists can speak to the strength of communities that have stood up to this violence, as well as to the millions of Americans affected by domestic terrorism and hate who are not represented here. As we examine the particular problem of violence directed at minority institutions, we would be wrong to assume that these incidents can be considered in a vacuum. Similarly, when studying these incidents, we should not be taken by the simplistic view that a crime was committed, that a culprit was caught, and that all is well. That is not how hate crime works. Domestic terrorism has a corrosive impact, not just on the survivors or the local community affected, but on minority communities across the country. Anyone who has experienced hate, excuse me, understands that acts of terror or hate-based violence are never limited to just one community or just one group of people. Those who have experienced such hate know it is only a matter of time until the perpetrators move on to another target. And the next target could be your family, your house of worship, or your neighborhood. Domestic terrorism invades our safe spaces and makes us feel like strangers in our own country. For communities that have been treated unfairly by law enforcement or by the government, the security measures designed to keep people safe can cause even more anxiety and a greater feeling of unease or otherness. Too many communities in recent years have felt the pain and fear of hate-fueled violence. For many, it has deepened existing wounds that have developed over centuries of bigotry and hate directed at them. For example, Jewish Americans have experienced a generational trauma that is the legacy of thousands of years of anti-Semitism. Every anti-Semitic act feels part of an ongoing story, and many other minority communities have a similar story to tell. Domestic terrorism is planned and carried out by groups and individuals who recruit by sowing distrust in our public institutions, spreading lies to divide Americans, and casting blame on minority groups. They target the spaces we should feel safest: our houses of worship, our community pillars, and our places of learning. Though ideology and motivation differ from person to person and group to group, in 2020, white supremacists, extremist militia members, and other violent far-right extremists were responsible for 66% of all domestic terror plots. And none of us should be shy about taking the fight to the worst perpetrators of these crimes. The threats facing minority institutions are varied, and the solutions are complex. We must begin by understanding the challenges we face, by examining a range of proposals for how best to respond. Last year, I was proud to join Congressman Brad Schneider in introducing H.R. 350, the Domestic Terror Prevention Act of 2021. This legislation would require DOJ, DHS, and the FBI to create offices that would monitor, investigate, and prosecute cases of domestic terrorism, focusing their resources on the most pressing threats. And I hope that this bill can be part of the solution. I thank the chair for holding this very important hearing. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Before I yield back, I ask unanimous consent that a statement from Jonathan Greenbach, CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, be entered into the record.
Mr. Chairman, without objection, so ordered. Thank you very much for your.
Thank you, and I yield
statement.
back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman, and I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for his opening statement.
I thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm grateful that you're holding this hearing today. I do express my gratitude to all the witnesses who are here. Appreciate, and I look forward to hearing your important testimony today. Today's hearing is entitled "The Rise in Violence Against Minority Institutions." I think that's an important topic. I state clearly, unequivocally, that placing bombs or making bomb threats or any threat of violence or violent act against a historically Black college or university or any institution is unacceptable. It must be investigated. It must be prosecuted. And if warranted, and after due process, an appropriate adjudication made. These things, I don't think anybody on this committee or in hopefully not within the sound of my voice would disagree with this. It is my understanding that the bomb threats that were recently made at historically Black colleges and universities, several of them, are actually being investigated now. And I am hopeful that those who are responsible will be identified and brought to justice. I think that's, if we're going to get a handle on this, you have to create the deterrent by bringing those folks in. And we want to deter further activity as well as punish those who were responsible for this. But there are other issues related to violent crime, as my colleague from Utah has mentioned. And that, in fact, as the chairwoman in her statement brought forth a very broad contextual statement about violent crime in America. Just yesterday, I and my Republican colleagues sent the chair a letter requesting that the subcommittee hold a hearing to investigate the recent reports that ICE released an illegal alien with ties to terrorism from custody for the reason that he might catch COVID-19. And that's an outrageous thing. And this committee should immediately hold a hearing on the matter. And I call upon the chair, and I look forward to working with the chair to schedule that hearing as soon as possible. Now, when we turn up my attention to today's hearing, we see crime rates, particularly violent crime rates, accelerating all over this nation. During the last 2 years, the United States has seen a spike in violent crime. And some may directly attribute it to the COVID outbreak and responses to that. And I don't discount that. But let's consider the numbers. In 2020, the United States tallied more than 20,000 murders, the highest total since 1995, and 4,000 more than in 2019. Preliminary FBI data for 2020 points to a 25% surge in murders. This would be the largest single year increase since the agency began publishing numbers in 1960. Despite the rises in crime, some on this committee, some of my colleagues across the aisle, continue to push efforts to defund the police. And just last week, a member of this subcommittee doubled down on calls to defund the police. And this follows the chairman stating in 2020 that there should be substantial cut to the New York City police budget. So when you cut police budgets, is there any surprise that violent crime escalates? In New York City, the NYPD's data shows that overall crime rate rose 11.2% in October 2021 compared to October 2020. This jump in crime continues after New York City defunded its police department by $1 billion. And now they're talking about restoring some of that. In Los Angeles County, homicides increased 23% from 555 in 2020 to 683 in 2021. The increased homicide rate occurred after Los Angeles defunded its police department by $150 million. No one should be surprised when we have prosecutors who refuse to prosecute crimes that violent crime goes up. Just one example, and there are many, but this is one example, comes from San Francisco, where District Attorney Chisa Bowden assumed office in January 2020. Bowden announced soon after his election that he was not going to seek the death penalty in any future cases. He would not pursue three strikes cases, and he would de-emphasize the prosecution of drug cases and property offenses. Since January 2020, gun violence and homicide have dramatically increased in San Francisco, where homicides have increased 31% during Bowden's first year in office. According to San Francisco police, vehicle break-ins increased between 100 and 750%, depending on the neighborhood. So-called smash and grabs at retail stores have become commonplace. Is anyone surprised when we release dangerous criminals awaiting trial that violent crime goes up? As we all know, in Waukesha, Wisconsin, Darrell Brooks was released on a $1,000 bond after running over a woman with a vehicle. He was released on bail despite having a lengthy criminal history, including a charge for aggravated battery, an outstanding warrant in Nevada after skipping bail for a sex-related crime as well. On November 21st, 2021, Brooks drove his car through a Christmas parade, injuring over 50 individuals and killing 6, one of whom was an 8-year-old child. Brooks now faces 8 counts of intentional homicide, 6 counts of hit and run involving death, 2 felonies for skipping bail, 2 counts of domestic abuse charges, and 61 counts of recklessly endangering safety for each injured person at the Christmas parade. Some of you may be asking what all of this has to do with today's hearing about violence against minority institutions. The answer is simple. When you defund the police and enact policies to embolden criminals, it often is the minority communities that pay the most egregious price. Shooting homicides are concentrated in underserved, impoverished minority communities. And I argue that hits hardest on the families that have lost loved ones as a result of violent crime. And the social institution of the family remains the most important in society, but it is damaged by violence. I mentioned smash and grab stores, retail stores. It's not isolated to San Francisco. It is often occurring all over the country, many times to minority-owned businesses. Couple this with the mayhem and destruction minority-owned businesses suffered as a result of the 2020 riots, and these small businesses continue to struggle to get by, especially nested in the context of the COVID pandemic. If we really want to tackle this issue, I would suggest we need to make sure that our police are adequately funded. We need to remove dangerous policies that allow violent criminals to hurt innocent victims. And I think that we need to continue to talk about the nature of community, the nature of family, the nature of individual responsibility to make sure that all of us are seeking to have strength in our communities, peace in our communities, that each person may actually achieve and fulfill the full measure of the creation that God gave to each one of them. That's my hope. I hope we come away from this hearing with shared perspectives. I know that we won't agree on everything, but I hope that we find the common areas that we can agree on and work to make this country better for every person in the country. And with that, Madam Chair, thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and just a moment for the chair's prerogative. Let me thank both Mr. Owens and Mr. Biggs for their presentation. But let me be very brief to emphasize to our members who I welcome to this hearing that this hearing should not be diminished, and the crisis of attacks on institutions out of racist attitudes and anti-religious attitudes and anti-Semitic attitudes should not be diminished. You may be somewhat premature in your statements as it relates to this committee's agenda. And I would also say that there are diverse opinions on this committee and in this Congress. Some in this Congress believe January 6th was a tourist event. Others do not. We know that the president and vice president are viewers of strong support of law enforcement, as there are members on this committee who have those views, and we respect all of those views. This is a crucial and important and life-saving effort to protect those who've been subjected to bomb threats across this nation. And I, for one, don't think we should stand for it and be silent about it. And we will go forward with this hearing, but we appreciate your comments, and you should look forward to hearings that will be addressing those questions as well. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Dr. Seth G Jones is a senior vice president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He leads a bipartisan team of over 50 resident staff and a network of non-resident affiliates dedicated to providing independent strategic insights and policy solutions that shape national security. He also teaches at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. He also served as the representative for the Commander, U.S. Special Operations Command, to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. Dr. David K. Wilson, the 10th president of Morgan State University, has more than 30 years of experience in higher education. Dr. Wilson holds 4 academic degrees, a Bachelor of Science in Political Science and a Master of Science in Education from Tuskegee University, a Master of Education in Educational Planning and Administration from Harvard University, and a Doctor of Education in Administration, Planning, and Social Policy, also from Harvard. He came to Morgan State from the University of Wisconsin, where he served as Chancellor of both the University of Wisconsin Colleges and the University of Wisconsin Extension. Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker has been the rabbi at Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas since 2006. He graduated from the University of Michigan in 1998 and attended Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion at its Jerusalem and Cincinnati campuses, receiving his rabbinical ordination in 2006 and a Master of Arts in Hebrew Letters in 2005. He is a past president of the Southwest Association of Reformed Rabbis and serves on the steering committee of Peace Together. Dr. Dimitri Trey Penny holds a Doctor of Education in Higher Education from Texas Tech University. He earned a Bachelor's in Criminal Justice from Midwestern State University and a Master's in Counseling from Fairview A&M University in 2006. He served 4 years in the U.S. Army, is a 22-year retired police sergeant with the Dallas Police Department, and currently serves as President and Executive Director at the National Fallen Officer Foundation. Mr. Pardeep Singh Kalika is a former police officer who is currently the Executive Director of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee. He is also a clinician who works as a de-radicalization interventionist to help individuals and families to help them exist the life of violent extremism. And I think it is to resist the life of violent extremism. He co-founded Serve to Unite following the murder of his father during the attack at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin. His organization works to build positive coalitions among communities and to address conflict and reconciliation through a public health lens. Brandon Tatum served 6 years with the Tucson Police Department and is the author of Beaten Black and Blue, Being a Black Cop in America Under Siege. Mr. Tatum received a Bachelor of Art from the University of Arizona and is currently working toward a master's from Grand Canyon University. As a police officer, became a SWAT operator, field training officer, general instructor, and a public information officer. Margaret Wang has been an advocate for human rights and racial justice for nearly 3 decades, and currently serves as the president and CEO of the Southern Poverty Law Center. She previously served as the executive director of Amnesty International USA. She received a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. She currently sits on the board of directors for the Progressive Multiplier Fund. We're delighted to have all of you as witnesses today. We welcome you as distinguished witnesses and important fact witnesses, and we thank you for your participation. I will begin by swearing in our witnesses. I ask our witnesses to turn on your audio so that you can be loud and clear, and make sure that I can see your face and your raised hand while I administer the oath. Do you swear or affirm, under penalty of perjury, that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Can I hear the witnesses, please?
I do.
I do.
That the
I do.
record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative, each and every one. Thank you so very much. Please note that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask you to summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time frame, there is a timing light on your screen. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes have expired. I do want to acknowledge to our members that those who will be giving victim testimony will be given a little time to be able to finish. I think you should know that out of courtesy to the victimization that they experience. So thank you very much for understanding. It is now my time to recognize Dr. Jones again for 5 minutes. And you may begin, Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, and Ranking Member Biggs, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My opening remarks are going to be divided into three sections. The first outlines the contours of domestic terrorism and the database that I'll be talking a little bit about. The second will actually focus on those trends, and the third are some implications for consideration for Congress. So let me begin with the first area. What I'm going to focus on is domestic terrorism, defined by the deliberate use or threat of violence by non-state actors to achieve political goals and to create a broad psychological impact. Violence and the threat of violence are critical components of the definition we use in our CSIS database. And this definition is largely consistent with the official US government definition of domestic terrorism under 18 US Code 2331. In focusing on domestic terrorism, I do want to highlight that we're not including all aspects of hate speech or hate crimes. Those are obviously deeply concerning, but what we're just focusing on is violence and the threat of violence. Our data set includes, I think, all cases, the universe of cases that we have identified since the early 1990s. We have worked consistently over the years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where I served briefly several years ago, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, and the National Counterterrorism Center. So we've shared our data and had useful back and forth. So let me get briefly to the second area, which is trends. The years 2020 and 2021, according to our data set, had the highest numbers of domestic terrorist attacks and plots in our data set. 2021, there were 73 attacks and plots in the United States. It was slightly down from 2020. This broad recent trend in domestic terrorist activity began around 2014. So from 2014 to 2021, there have been an average of about 31 fatalities per year. The number of fatalities in 2021 are kind of an average number. We've seen years with much larger numbers of fatalities, including 1995, Oklahoma City, 2001, September 11th. But the numbers of fatalities certainly are concerning. Terrorist attacks and plots spanned 18 states, including Washington, D.C. Many of these events took place in metropolitan areas, but these cities were dispersed across the US. I think it's worth highlighting some of the targets and tactics as well. The types of weapons we're seeing used varied somewhat by perpetrator. For white supremacists and like-minded attackers, we saw a primary focus on firearms. For anarchists, anti-fascists, and others, we saw a primary focus on melee weapons, so knives and blunt instruments. So some variation in the types of weapons that domestic terrorists are using. In terms of targets, what's interesting is, according to our data, government, military, and police locations and personnel are the most frequently targeted by domestic terrorist attacks, regardless of perpetrator orientation. But we do see very concerning attacks against minorities and minority institutions, not just the attack this year, but also a number of them. The Patrick Crusius murder of 22 people focused predominantly on immigrants at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas in 2019. The Robert Bowers attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. So we have seen a very concerning focus on a range of individuals based on their racial, ethnic, religious, political makeup, actually including misogynistic attacks as well in the US. So very briefly on implications, particularly for Congress, I continue to believe that the US government needs to provide much more comprehensive data on terrorist attacks, plots, and I support the FBI and other agencies providing annual or biannual reports to a range of committees in the US. And then lastly, strongly support continuing to support state, local, and other enforcement agencies that they're appropriately resourced to identify and respond to attacks left of boom. So that I will conclude my opening remarks, and obviously happy to take questions later on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. Dr. Wilson is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair Lee, Ranking Committee Member Biggs, other members of the subcommittee. I'm David K. Wilson, the 10th president of Morgan. Morgan is 8,500 student high research university here in Baltimore, Maryland. Madam Chair, the purpose of this gathering today is to address the bomb threats made to Morgan and to more than 20 other HBCUs this year alone. And I have to start by saying that as a young Black boy growing up in rural, segregated Jim Crow, Alabama on a sharecropping plantation, who was not permitted to, of course, attend school full time until I was in the 7th grade, I have experienced firsthand this type of trauma and this type of racial violence, if you will. And this is why I have devoted my entire career to providing educational leadership to campuses to enable them to nurture the intellectual growth of Black students and not to stifle it. And it is so unfortunate that there is so much hatred in our nation today, being held by those who are trying to simply prevent HBCUs from educating a disproportionate number of Black students. Yes, the vast majority of these more than 100 institutions have been around since the mid-19th century. And from their inception, they have just simply been targets of domestic terrorism. I have outlined in my written testimony example after example, dating back to the destruction of Wilberforce University in Ohio, of Lemoyne-on College in Tennessee, of Wiley College in Texas, of my own alma mater, Tuskegee University, that saw 75 Klansmen march through the campus and through town, if you will, because they did not want Black physicians to be at the John A. Andrew Hospital ministering to the needs of veterans. The list goes on and on and on. And even at my own national treasure, Morgan State University, our students had to fight just to integrate shops right across the street from us. They too were victims of domestic terrorism for years, but they did not give up. Members of the subcommittee, this is not 1865. It is not 1923. It is not 1962. This is 2022. But these domestic acts of terror persist across HBCUs. You know, yes, there is much too much ignorance, much too much misunderstanding that exists today about these historic institutions in American higher education. Our HBCUs are not some radical terror camps, which apparently is wrapped up in the distorted imagination of domestic terrorists. Our campuses are not places, if you will, where our students are taught to hate this country or to engage in activity to destroy the fabric of our democracy. Quite the contrary. HBCUs have always had their foundation, if you will, as one that prepares, inspires, motivates, and encourages our students to live out the American dream, to become the engineers and the elected officials. Many of you attended our institutions, to become the doctors, the lawyers, the architects, the engineers, the judges. That's what our institutions have been about. And we have been about that because we too believe very strongly in the American dream. We believe that we contribute the talent in order to make this country more competitive internationally. And so I just humbly ask the nation today, is this not the heart of what a truly functioning, inclusive democracy should be? Well, I believe the answer is clear to all who is willing to see it. HBCUs are part and parcel of America. We're national treasures, and we deserve the utmost veneration, we deserve the utmost respect, and we deserve the utmost protection. And so as I bring my remarks to a close, I would simply like to say that HBCUs have created the Black middle class in this country. And we will always be the truth tellers. We will always be the innovators. And as we come through this bitterly polarized era of American history, our campuses are fully prepared to be the single group of institutions, if need be, that can ultimately keep our democracy from an untimely and unwarranted demise. We will not let anything cloud our focus. Our students, if you will, deserve to feel safe and be safe. And we will never, ever, ever be deterred from what our ancestors gave their blood for. And it was to ensure that these campuses were holding high the ideals in the US Constitution and educate students to grow the future and indeed lead the world. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dr. Wilson, thank you for that powerful testimony. Your time has expired, but your message continues to reverberate. Thank you very much for your testimony today. It is my privilege to now yield 5 minutes to Rabbi Citron Walker. Rabbi, you're recognized for 5 minutes and welcome.
Chair Jackson Lee, Vice Chair Bush, Ranking Member Biggs. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you this morning. I'm honored to have Chairman Nadler join us this morning, and I'm pleased to see Representative Demings, who was so gracious when I testified for the first time ever just last week before her subcommittee. I believe and often teach that Judaism is filled with contradictions because life is filled with contradictions. And today I am filled with mixed and even contradictory emotions. On the one hand, I'm truly horrified that in our society today, religious leaders must devote themselves to security training. How to harden our facilities is both a necessary conversation and anathema to religious ideals of hospitality and loving the stranger. At the same time, I'm filled with gratitude. I'm grateful to be here. This feeling hasn't gone away. I'm grateful to be anywhere. I'm grateful to be anywhere because a terrorist chose a Jewish synagogue because he thought that Jews control the world. He thought that he could take Jews hostage, call up an influential rabbi, and she would snap her fingers and give him what he wanted. He truly believed that Jews control the media, that Jews control the government, that Jews control everything. Tragically, this is just one aspect of anti-Semitism that has been so harmful to the Jewish people throughout history. Over the centuries, entire Jewish communities have been destroyed because people believe that Jews drank the blood of non-Jewish children. Entire Jewish communities have been destroyed because people believe that Jews wanted to torture communion wafers. Entire Jewish communities have been destroyed because people believe that Jews were responsible for all the bad things in life, that we are the root of all evil. And as absurd as it sounds, every single outrageous lie about the Jewish people has been shared in various forms by people from all walks of life in recent years. It's sad, it is ridiculous, and it is maddening that I was taken hostage because of it. Far too many Jews have died because of it. This anti-Semitism isn't distant history. This is a month ago. This is now. This is years of increased harassment and attacks against my people. The potential of an anti-Semitic incident is what led me to attend around half a dozen security-related seminars over the past 6 years. It's a part of why we developed a security action plan and strengthened our relationship with local law enforcement. It motivated me to apply for and receive a grant from the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, for which we have such appreciation. The chances that something could have happened were so small. Even so, we knew it was a possibility and we wanted to be as prepared as possible. Thankfully, we had taken so many constructive steps. And yet I don't know if anyone could have ever been fully prepared. On the morning of January 15th, when the gunman arrived, it was me and one volunteer in the building. I was running late. I was finishing my preparations, and in the midst of trying to do a million different things, I had a stranger come to the door. I have, of course, thought about that moment a great deal. I welcomed a terrorist into my congregation. I live with that responsibility. And it's important for you to understand that this was not a matter of me opening the door just because I value hospitality. I do value hospitality. The Torah scroll that we read from each week was gifted to our congregation thanks to hospitality. I strive to live that value every day. Like so many congregations, CBI strives to be a house of prayer for all people. And at the same time, I also value security. In a small congregation, I was rabbi, in tech support, and gatekeeper. When our member asked if I knew the person at the door, I was distracted. But I still did a visual inspection, and after a brief word, he appeared to be who he said he was. A guy who spent the night outside in sub 40-degree weather. And after talking with him more, his story added up. Of course, I was wrong. I was so wrong. I share this because despite all the plans and funding and courses, I still opened the door. But because of all the plans and funding and courses and literally dozens of small things that just happened to go right, to go our way, we were able to escape. No one should fear gathering or pray. No one should fear gathering to pray or celebrate or mourn or connect in their spiritual home. No one should experience such hatred and violence. No one should experience anything remotely like what I had to. In 1947, back in 47, perhaps the leading rabbi of that time, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, told the Senate Labor Committee that equality of opportunity for Jews can be truly secured only in a genuinely democratic society. He continued, accordingly, we seek to fight every manifestation of racism, to promote the civil and political equality of all groups and persons in America, and to support measures designed to safeguard civil liberties, to build a better America. We regard ethnic discrimination directed against any group as a single and indivisible problem as one of the most urgent problems of a democratic society. Nothing more gravely threatens American democracy today than the fact of its incompleteness. Democracy, to be secure, must be complete. An incomplete democracy is an insecure democracy. Members of the committee, I would add that the converse is equally true. An insecure democracy is an incomplete democracy, and too many communities in our democracy today feel insecure. Tragically, we live in a world where houses of worship need protection, where too many of all backgrounds are victims of hate crimes. And I believe that both Democrats and Republicans want to change that reality. Changing our reality all at once is too much to ask. That's why Rabbi Tarfon taught that we aren't obligated to complete the work, but we can't neglect it. I'm not here today asking you to complete the work, but we need your help. Please hear the diverse group of witnesses who come before you today. We are all struggling. We all need practical and intelligent solutions to help all of us feel safe and secure. It is truly an honor for me to speak with you today. I'm so grateful for the opportunity.
Rabbi, again, we embrace you, we mourn with you, and we hear your call to action. Thank you for your testimony today, equally powerful. It's my pleasure now to recognize Dr. Penny for 5 minutes. Dr. Penny, welcome.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, Chairman Nadler, and Ranking Member Biggs, and other distinguished members of the committee for allowing me to speak. On behalf of the National Fallen Officer Foundation, I am honored to appear before this committee to speak on a topic that's so near and dear to my heart, protecting our police and our communities. As a law enforcement advocate, I speak on behalf of the hundreds of police families across this nation that have lost loved ones in the line of duty when I say enough is enough. According to FBI statistics, in 2021, 73 police officers were shot and killed in the line of duty, the highest number of police officers murdered in 20 years. The FBI also noted that the rise of anti-police sentiment has led to a rash of attacks on police. Last year alone, there were 86 premeditated ambush-style attacks on police officers, in which 26 of those officers died. These tragedies can no longer be ignored or tolerated in our civilized society. So why is this happening? Well, one reason why they're happening is because of widespread online radicalization, the indoctrination of individuals online using negative content to incite violence and create division. So because of this, not only have we had American citizens travel abroad to join extremist groups like ISIS, some have even been radicalized here at home and have taken up arms against our police and the American people. On July 7, 2016, the world watched in horror as a lone gunman ambushed police officers in downtown Dallas, Texas, during the Black Lives Matter rally. During that attack, 12 police officers were shot and 5 of them were killed. The investigation found that the shooter was radicalized online and was obsessed with police-involved shootings in the Black community. In 2017, I filed a federal lawsuit against Facebook, Google, and Twitter for failing to manage their platforms and allowing domestic extremist groups to recruit, radicalize, and incite violence against our police. That case is known as Penny versus Twitter. Although the companies admitted to knowing that their platforms were being used for nefarious activities, the courts were reluctant to move against the immunity protections offered under Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, and nothing was ever done. 5 years later, the problem has worsened, and our police officers have seemingly been caught in the middle of corporate profitability and government limitations. In fact, we continue to see these platforms being used in the same manner, facilitating attacks on our law enforcement and our government itself. During the George Floyd riots in 2020, social media was being used not only to facilitate the riots, but also to help radical groups organize and fundraise off that narrative. The riots led to more than $2 billion in property damage, several hundred police officers being injured, and 19 citizens being killed. Among them were 77-year-old St. Louis police captain David Dorn, whose murder was broadcast live on Facebook. It was reported that more than 17,000 people were arrested during the George Floyd riots, but to this date, only very few prosecutions have been reported. In fact, the tide is seemingly turning in the opposite direction, as progressive DAs across this country are now prosecuting police officers for responding to those same riots. Unfortunately, today, there appears to be more advocates in the court system for the criminals than there are for the victims. Last year, 27 of our nation's largest cities have saw a drastic increase in homicides. I'm from one of those cities, Houston, Texas. Since 2019, Houston has seen a 73% increase in homicides. In fact, over the last year, judges in Houston, Harris County have released 113 defendants charged with capital murder back onto our streets. And those same offenders have contributed to more than 150 murders while out on bond. It's no secret that America has become unsafe on the heels of social justice movements, bail reform initiatives, and intentional efforts to defund our police across the country. These policies have not reduced crime. To the contrary, they've augmented crime, especially in our nation's inner city communities. The solution is simple to solve the crime problem. We have to keep our violent criminals behind bars, punish bad behavior, and hold social media companies accountable.
Gentleman's time has expired.
In
The
upholding
gentleman's time has expired. Thank you very much
Thank you.
for your testimony. Mr. Kalika, you're recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Nadler, Chair Jackson Lee, Ranking Member Biggs, and distinguished member of the subcommittee. My name is Pardeep Singh Kalika. I'm a former police officer, educator, and trauma clinician. I currently serve as the executive director of the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee. Today, however, I come before you as a member of the Sikh American community, whose life was forever changed by the 2012 assault on the Gurdwara, our Sikh house of worship in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. On Sunday, August 5th, 2012, my family was on our way to the Sikh temple of Wisconsin when my daughter confessed that she had forgotten her notebook for Sunday school. I admit that I was a little bit irritated, but we returned to our house, found that notebook, and headed back out again. When we arrived at the Gurdwara, the parking lot was filled with police vehicles. My immediate concern was for my mother and father, who were always the first to arrive and prepare for services. While in the parking lot, I received a call from someone inside the building who told me that my father had been shot. That conversation was interrupted by a call from my mother, who whispered that she was hiding with others inside the building. My concern turned into urgency to find out if our loved ones were safe or not. Eventually, it was confirmed that my father, Sitron Kalika, was among 6 worshipers who was killed at that attack, along with Parmjit Kaur Saini, Sita Singh, Ranjit Singh, Prakash Singh, and Suveg Singh Khadra. A 7th individual, Baba Punjab Singh, passed away in 2020 due to complications from the injuries he sustained that day. If my daughter had not forgotten her notebook, we could have been also killed. Rather than turning inward in anguish and anger, we chose to believe that this country, its ideals, and its promise are worth fighting for. For example, not long after we began a campaign with the Sikh Coalition to ensure that the anti-Sikh sentiment would be tracked and reported to the FBI. Once the Bureau began cataloging anti-Sikh hate crimes, their reports have shown what every Sikh American already knows, that we are among the top 5 most frequently targeted faith communities in America. When we learned that the shooter, Wade Michael Page, had extensive ties to a white supremacist movement, I befriended Arnold Michaelis, a former white supremacist and the founder of the Milwaukee chapter of the hate organization that Wade Page belonged to. Over the past 10 years, Arnold and I have traveled to countless cities, consulted with local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, and spoke to thousands of people on how to prevent hate in their own communities. I also work as a de-radicalization clinician with Parents for Peace and as a consultant with Not in Our Town. These organizations are on the front lines providing counseling and treatment plans to engage entire communities and help individuals turn away from hate. Despite these best efforts, hate continues to threaten too many minority communities in our country. A Black church was attacked in South Carolina. Synagogues were assaulted in Pennsylvania, California, and Texas. Masjids have been targeted for vandalism, arson, and violence across the country. And individuals from these communities and still others are increasingly targeted in hate crimes year after year after year. All of this fear and hate and danger comes from a toxic mix of racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and white supremacy. As we meet this challenge, I urge you to ensure that the policies that you implement to protect marginalized communities cannot be turned against us. Post 9/11 surveillance and profiling eroded trust within law enforcement that harmed Black and brown families, all while white supremacist extremism went largely unchecked. We must shift our framework to counter extremism from one fixated on security and law enforcement to one rooted in public health and community engagement. We must further invest in our communities and empower the advocates who are leading at the local level. We have to de-radicalize those who are entrenched in hate and invest in early stage interventions that work to cure the pain that often precedes acts of violence in our society. Our way to do this is by ensuring that what is taught in our schools is both accurate and represents the rich tapestry that makes up America. Another way is to hold social media platforms accountable for violent hate speech. There are also bills that Congress could pass today. The Justice for Victims of Hate Crimes Act would instantly improve how we charge hate crimes. We can then further improve our data tracking around these crimes. Passing the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act would more effectively combat white supremacist extremism. And finally, we can do better to facilitate access to federal resources, like the nonprofit security grant, to protect sacred places, like our Gurdwara in Oak Creek. We can do all of these things and more, but only if we are willing to work together in the pursuit of prevention and safety through a whole of society approach. As a father who is fighting to make the world a better place for my children, that is my wish. That is why, above anything else, I am here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your testimony and your important message. It is important that we hear it. Mr. Tatum, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
I just want to first off say thank you, Jerry Nadler, Sheila Jackson Lee, Ranking Member Biggs, for having me. This is a true honor and a testimony in our country that we've come a long way, and that a person of color like myself have access to speak. And I think it speaks volumes of how far we've come. And I think that it's time in our country that we don't return back to the things that, you know, many want to retain in our history. We should continue to move forward. First thing that I want to say is that it's very important for us to be able to define acts of terrorism and be able to investigate them thoroughly. We have to understand that there's a lot of hoax that have been perpetuated over the last several years. And I want us to, in addition to focusing on the hate crimes, and I think that every single person that is here understands that it is a problem in our country and that we need to address it vigorously. But we also need to identify the influx of people who are coming out and creating situations and lying about hate crime and violence in certain situations to gain traction in their particular movements. There has been a tremendous increase, like I said, is written in my statement, and we have seen it happen all too often on college campuses. Unfortunately, many of them are perpetuated by minorities in our communities. Young ladies who have made statements that there were writings and racial slurs perpetuated on campus, some nooses and other things that are associated with hate crimes, come to find out that they were all perpetuated by the person who reported it. So in addition to our research and our efforts to combat terrorism in institutions, we also need to look at and help verify whether or not these things are true or not. I want to talk about another issue that I think will speak to the very grounds of people in our country who have been demoralized. And I think that is the lack of retaining God in our consciousness. I really would love to see people who are in leadership in our government continue to retain God and not throw God away and act as if God wasn't the help and the foundation of this country. The reason that we are where we are today in our country is because the Judeo-Christian values that we have retained. And I think that people have been demoralized and they're apt to commit these crimes and be hateful towards one another because of the absence of God. And I'll add as well, when it comes to law enforcement, many people who are on this Zoom call right now have been perpetuating hatred towards law enforcement officers and has led to the police officers being dejected. They are not engaging. They are not being proactive. And many of these efforts, or many of the lack of efforts on behalf of police officers who are scared to do their job and fearful of terrorist activity against them, and also fearful of judgment, prejudgment, and being called a racist and working in a racial institution, these officers are not able, or they are not proactively policing, which will deter a lot of these actors from going into synagogue, from acting out in violence. The ones who are standing in the gap for us to protect our citizens are the police officers. And when you diminish them, they're no longer going to be there. They're retiring, they're quitting, and we cannot get enough officers in the field to combat this. And I want everybody on here to understand that our law enforcement officers are incredibly important if we are going to fight against this influx of terrorism and terrorist behavior. And the last thing that I will say is that we do need to also include the institution of the family. Many of these minority communities are falling apart, and we see a lot of degradation because of the institution of the family that's under attack. So in addition to the college and universities and other Black businesses, I also think we should focus, in addition, on the Black family and inner city minority families, because the stronger the family becomes, the better prepared they are, the better people are put out into society, and the better equipped they are in not becoming victims in the society that we live in. I want to first end this by saying thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to have my voice being heard, and I'm here to answer any questions subsequent to my testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lawn, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee, Ranking Member Biggs, Chairman Nadler, and all members of the subcommittee. My name is Margaret Huang, and I'm President and CEO of the Southern Poverty Law Center and the SPLC Action Fund. The recent bomb threats against almost 24 historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, over the last 2 weeks have been deeply impactful, threatening a collective sense of security and safety. These hateful threats, apparently timed to coincide with the beginning of Black History Month, are reminiscent of this country's long history of white supremacist attacks on Black leaders and Black churches, attacks with the explicit goal of terrorizing Black communities to assert control. Of the 107 HBCUs in the United States, 44 are located in the 5 states of the Deep South, where the Southern Poverty Law Center has significant presence and a commitment to social justice. These states are Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. These threats impact both our community and our staff. We have staff members who are proud HBCU alum, and many others who have children and family members who are students, faculty, or graduates of HBCUs. It's been almost 60 years since the Ku Klux Klan members bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 schoolgirls. Yet we are still grappling with hateful acts targeting racial and religious minorities. At a time when many states are passing laws restricting teaching about racism, it is clear that more needs to be done to teach our young people the unvarnished truth about American history, both the good and the bad. To help the subcommittee understand the context for the racist attacks on the HBCUs, my written testimony describes how the current extremist threat is being mainstreamed, how to prevent hate crimes and address online radicalization, the importance of evidence-based violence prevention initiatives, and the need to ensure that our students have digital literacy skills taught in an inclusive educational environment. When our educational and religious communities are targeted for violence and vandalism, it is imperative that the needs of survivors are prioritized. Our instinct is to increase physical security for our houses of worship and community institutions, higher walls, more cameras, more bulletproof glass, and even armed guards. But these steps must be coupled with a commitment to fund research and prevention initiatives to address hate and the long-term contributions to extremism. Passage of the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act would be a key advance in this effort. Press reports indicate that the FBI has focused its investigation on 6 radicalized tech-savvy youth suspects. One of the young offenders reportedly claimed a connection with the Adam Waffen Division, a terroristic neo-Nazi organization that we have been tracking over the past 5 years. The possible connection to extremist groups underscores the needs for parents, educators, and communities to be attuned to signs of radicalization and to help inoculate young people against being drawn into an extreme and hateful path. We're pleased that the DOJ, DHS, and the FBI have launched criminal investigations into this case, but more must be done. My testimony includes several policy recommendations for Congress and the administration. First, words matter. It's impossible to overstate the importance of elected officials and community and business leaders using their public platforms to condemn these threats to HBCUs and other communal institutions. Second, oversight matters. We appreciate the attention of this committee, Congress, and the Biden administration that you have devoted to addressing white supremacy and extremism in all forms, and this must continue. And finally, investments matter. We urge you to make investments in countering disinformation, developing prevention strategies, and offering anti-bias education. Disinformation and conspiracy theories are galvanizing attacks on our democracy and government institutions. Teachers must be able to teach the full truth, including about the hard history of slavery, racism, and white supremacy in the United States. These investments can help secure a future in which all can gather, worship, and live free of terrorist and extremist threats in a nation as good as its highest ideals. We look forward to working with you as you continue your focus to ensure our treasured HBCUs are safe spaces for all. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Let me thank you so very much and all the witnesses for their testimony. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. And I begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Again, just a brief moment of chair's privilege to indicate the cruciality and importance of this hearing and the witnesses who have come here today to speak to the dangers that they have experienced, I think should be the highlight of this hearing. As indicated, hearings regarding other issues are pending, and we will address those issues. I also will make note that the members that I know in this committee are not the cause of violence against law enforcement officers, and I would take issue with any statements to that effect. Let me begin by saying to you, Dr. Wilson, my time is short, but I do want to frame the danger of bomb threats to the psychic and the operation of a historically Black college where there has been generational trauma. And if you can concisely give us that for the record, I want to make sure people understand that. Dr. Wilson, if you would, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Indeed, the psychological impact that the continuation of these threats are having on our young minds cannot be understated. Our students here at Morgan and across the HBCU world are on the campuses when they first saw the murder of Trayvon Martin, and they were 8, 9 years old. And then following that, they saw a series of other individuals whose lives were cut down, who also were in their age group and who looked like them. And then all of a sudden, we had the pandemic, and then George Floyd. And then they were shut out in these spaces for a year and a half. And we have the largest enrollment here in Morgan ever because the students wanted to come to campuses where they could exhale, where they could actually reacquaint themselves with the kind of emotional well-being that the campus actually provides. And then all of these bomb threats. And you wouldn't believe just how taxed our counseling center and resources have been just to minister to the incredible needs of these students. It's off the chart. I don't mean to in any way move beyond the kind of, I don't mean to in any way try and describe this, Madam Chair, in any way, but it actually is. We are seeing so many students who are almost coming to the brink because they can't bear it anymore. And as president, I have to say to them, you know, this is not who we are. This is not our country. This is not our nation. And I have to really try and keep that together. Our faculty here, I'm speaking in terms of Morgan, but it's the same, whether it's Prairie View or Howard or Morehouse or Spelman or North Carolina A&T. And so I hope that the committee will not take lightly the incredible psychological and emotional damage that these threats
are perpetrating on our young minds.
Mr. Wilson, thank you. Dr. Jones, bomb threats can result in bombs and violence. Is that not true?
That is true. Yes.
And so the idea of a more stronger federal presence should be taken seriously, and bomb threats should not be taken lightly based upon your collective data and statistics about racism and anti-Semitism and other anti. Dr. Jones?
Yes, bomb threats, particularly when they involve an actual plot to conduct an attack or to threaten to conduct an attack, is a serious effort, and one that we would consider an act of terrorism. I mean, that's its intent, is to terrorize a population. It should be taken extremely serious for the reasons we just heard. That's the psychological impact of it.
Thank you. The nation should not stand idly by when there is racism, anti-Semitism, bias against LGBTQ, gender bias, anti-Muslim, anti-Sikh. Mr. Kalika, my sympathies for the loss of your father, the injury of your fellow members of the Sikh community. I was very much aware of that as a member of the Homeland Security Committee and in Congress at that time. Tell me the terrorizing impact that comes from the hatred that was obviously generated against the Sikh community.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Yeah, I mean, it took all of us in 10 years to try to heal from that. And I think that's the effect of communal trauma. We used to understand trauma-related disorders as being individual or something that you needed to go through by yourself. We're very much understanding it now to be communal. And these types of attacks, whether it's on law enforcement, whether it's on the Jewish community, this does have a type of communal traumatic effect. And it causes on everyone within those communities to heal from within and help, and the communities from outside to help those communities heal. So we were blessed to be surrounded by great communities, great interfaith partners who helped us heal. And so we're still in the midst of that. And we're still concerned about our fellow Jewish brothers and sisters, our Muslim brothers and sisters, our law enforcement community, everyone is. And I think the heart of this goes to, we need to prevent targeted violence against all of these communities.
Let me just quickly go, Rabbi, and my fellow Texan, I welcome you again. And I think the point that I want to really focus on with you is my last question. I really want to focus on that anti-Semitism and racism and all the isms can result into actual physical violence. We're holding this hearing not for edification, but for the understanding that threats can result in physical violence. You lived it. You started in your testimony by saying you're grateful to be anywhere. Can you associate the attacks on the Jewish community and anti-Semitism, the rise of that, to actual violence and loss of life?
Well, thank God in our situation, I said at our healing service afterwards that we didn't have to say Kaddish. We didn't have to say the prayer for mourning. And it was unbelievably, we're so fortunate on so many levels. Our words matter, right? We have seen this time and again, and it's words, whether they are anti-Semitic, it doesn't matter the group that is targeted, right? We're in a situation that the more people get exposure to that negativity, the more people can pass it on. Everybody's not going to go and do a violent act, but if you have a larger pool of people, then you have a larger group of people that are going to take the next step towards extremism and the next step towards extremism. And you're going to have a larger pool of people willing to actually do something horrible. And when it comes to that idea that our words matter and that all of us bear a responsibility, each and every one of us from across the political spectrum, from every group, we need to be able to tone down the rhetoric. We need to be able to support one another. We're not enemies here. We're one nation that are all trying to, come together and solve our problems, and we've got big problems to solve. But so our words do matter, because violence is not what any of us want to experience, but it absolutely can happen. Again, yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your answers. Mr. Biggs, I recognize you now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to make sure that everyone understands here. I don't think there's anybody on this committee testifying as a witness or here as a member of Congress that is minimizing the threats to the HBCUs. I mean, there's no one here that doesn't taking that seriously. I think we're talking about also, however, a broad context of all kinds of issues that we must take very seriously. And so that's, I mean, I hope no one thinks that. I appreciate Dr. Jones and one of the things he talked about, because he said there's a broad range of racial, religious, and misogynistic attacks that take place. And I can't help but remember my own faith, my own denomination, driven from 5 states and finally from New York to Ohio, to Missouri, to Illinois, and ultimately to the safety of the Rocky Mountain Intermountain West. And I was just pondering this as we've, preparing for this hearing. So that persecution of my own people, now that's a long time ago. But then I look at the last 3 months, 4 months, and actually 10 years ago in my own community in Phoenix, one of our churches burned, vandalized. And then I don't know what the motivations were for any of these next attacks I'll mention, but we need to be cognizant that this is happening. And I think that's what this hearing does. So in December of 2021 in Alabama at an LDS church, a shooting takes place on members of the church. A shooting in July of 2018, vandalism in Connecticut, shooting up a church in Connecticut in 2021, end of 2021, I believe it was December. Syracuse, Utah, 2021, vandalism of that church. This is happening against all kinds of groups that associate with one another, faith-based groups, religious groups, whatever it is. And so I think it's important for us to realize that and not rationalize any of this away. I think it's important to get that. But I want to ask Dr. Penny and Mr. Tatum, in the summer of 2020, we saw a lot of rioting in the streets, resulting in destruction, looting of small businesses in urban communities. What communities are most affected negatively by that type of activity? Let's go with you, Dr. Penny first, and then Mr. Tatum.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Look, this is what we need to make sure we clarify. When these policies are being passed to defund the police and narratives that are destructive to any society as a whole, you have to understand that our majority minority communities are suffering the most. And we saw this same idea in the early 90s. I grew up in the 18th Congressional District, which is the chairwoman's district, and I witnessed my own cousin get killed in front of me at the age of 16. Those negative ideas create this same level of violence that we continue to perpetuate now during this time. 20-something years later, there's no reason for us to continue to create this kind of divide. But the reality is, as you have certain congressional leaders, certain leaders in our society that want to press this idea of defunding the police and segregating the police from their communities, all they're doing is making the people that live in these communities more and more victims. That's all they're doing, is victimizing us over and over again. And I'd like to say, matter, just please consider that this is a reality for people that are actually in the inner city. And I'm in these communities every day. I don't just sit up here and talk. I'm in there every day. And I want to encourage you to come out there and meet with some of them, because this is real life and these people are living it.
Thank you, Mr. Tatum.
I think I share the same sentiment, being former law enforcement officer, and I've seen the rhetoric affect law enforcement all across the country, and law enforcement officers aren't just white. So, there's minorities that work in law enforcement that feel the brunt of rhetoric. And I agree with the rabbi when he said that words matter. We have to stop being divisive. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. I believe that we can empower our law enforcement officers. We can fund them. We can support them. We can judge them fairly. And we will see a difference in the way police officers are patrolling our communities, and they're keeping them safe. I'm thankful to God that our law enforcement officers are there when these instances of hate happen, so they can bring these individuals to justice and also protect. I mean, to see them be able to negotiate an individual out of murdering multiple people who he had hostage and taking them into custody without harm is impressive. And I think that we want to see law enforcement officers participate in these certain situations. And also, I would argue that terrorism can happen within. There is intraracial terrorism that we see in our country today. A lot of what Black violence or what Black people see when they experience violence are within their own community. I grew up in Black communities, and to be honest, I was more afraid of other people who were Black, who hated me, who wanted to kill me, who was involved in gang violence, than I was of a white supremacist or someone of that nature. So we do have to expand what we're saying, not diminish, but expand what we're saying to protect young Black people who are experiencing the same level of hate within their own communities, and also extend the olive branch to support law enforcement so that law enforcement officers are equipped to help, and we can all be better for it.
Madam Chair, I see my time has expired. I would ask the chair I have 12 articles. I know you aren't going to want me to read the titles of all 12, but I'd like to submit them into the record, and I will have my staff provide those to you right after the committee hearing.
Ms. Biggs, you know that we welcome those articles, and without objection, so ordered, and you're very kind to have them by list, and we thank you so very much for your questioning. At this time, I'm pleased to recognize the chair of the full committee, Mr. Nadler, for 5 minutes. Mr. Nadler?
Thank
Chairman
you, Madam
Nadler.
Chair. Dr. Jones, are extremists using COVID-19 anxiety and the government's response to their strategic advantage? And if they are, is it limited just to propaganda and recruitment, or are you also seeing it as a motivation for violent attacks?
That's a great question, Mr. Nadler, and thanks for participating in the hearing. The data that we have shows that COVID-19 is certainly being used to motivate individuals to extremist beliefs. It's particularly helpful on the radicalization process. What we don't see a lot yet is evidence that is being used to actually commit domestic terrorist attacks or plots, for that matter. So radicalization definitely is that concerning? Absolutely, but we don't see it yet manifesting itself into actually attacks yet. The data does not yet show that.
Thank you, Mr. Kalika. You were very involved in your community's recovery from the Oak Creek tragedy, and you diligently worked on de-radicalization efforts, interfaith coordination, and law enforcement outreach. Given your background as a former law enforcement officer, what changes do you think law enforcement departments should consider so that they are more responsive to domestic violent extremist threats against minority communities?
Thank you, Chair Nadler. I think when we think about March 2020 and what was going on at that time and the heightened tensions, we brought together community stakeholders, we brought together law enforcement officers and the local activists to have conversations and meet one another. We've been continuing to provide bridges of dialogue, of conversation, even if people didn't get along. Since that time that we've been healing and going into sort of de-radicalization work, we have to get much further upstream. If you're waiting for somebody, and there's been numerous incidents, I can count 3 right now of ones that I know that we prevented from happening. And part of that was to get further upstream and not wait till the gunman or the suspect shows up to the synagogue, the masjid, the Gurdwara, the church. If we don't get further upstream, it's too late at that point. And it's too late for law enforcement, unfortunately, at that point. And I speak this as respectful of the capacity of law enforcement officers, but even law enforcement officers know that we need to get much further upstream and stop it at the house, stop it at the faith community, stop it with somebody who can say something at that point.
Thank you. Rabbi Citron Walker, Deuteronomy says you must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You let your attacker in because he told you he was hungry and had spent the night in the cold. How does the concept of generosity to strangers shape your role as a rabbi? And do you believe the threat of domestic terrorism might erode that identity?
Well, I guess it's my hope that it's, first of all, thank you for the question, Chairman Nadler. And that idea of love the stranger, care for the stranger is something that is a value that I continue to try to live. It's a part of who we are. I think that the threat of domestic terrorism, I think the threat against the Jewish community is very much, for many people, creating a sense of fear and concern. And it is a real challenge. So at the same time, right, the chances of a terrorist attack are so remote that I pray that we don't give in to that fear. I do believe that we have to be prepared. I think that all of those security trainings were very important, but I still teach and I still preach. Love your neighbor. I still teach and I still preach that we need to care for the stranger. We need to embrace that value of hospitality that is so much a part of our tradition.
Do you believe that fear of domestic terror attacks has affected how we all treat one another? And if so, how?
I think that, at least in my community, within the Peace Together community that we've really worked hard to establish, the threat of domestic terror has actually brought a number of us more together in the community. And that is from the, on the interreligious and non-religious side. It is also what led us to develop really positive relationships with the police department. There are a number of Jews of color that throughout our country that see a security officer and outside their house of worship and are a little bit concerned because of it, because they are concerned that they might be treated with suspicion. But overall, within our community, I can say that the relationship, the closeness between the local police department, the local government, and the interreligious and non-religious communities has been incredibly strong. And my hope and my prayer would be that every community would be able to have those relationships, because we don't, right? We don't, and we have to acknowledge that reality. And so but that is one of the things that really helps to sustain us and continues to sustain us in the aftermath.
Thank you. My time has expired and I yield back.
The gentleman's time is expired, and Mr. Biggs, you're still here. I just wanted to be assured that you don't have another member at this time that may have come in. Mr. Biggs.
Madam Chair, I am looking and my staff is looking. We had 4 members on earlier, but I think they might have all departed. And so I might be a lonely Republican on this hearing today.
Well, we will look out for those members, and we thank you for your presence. It's my pleasure now to yield to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses today. Let me, as a former law enforcement officer, as you well know, my committee members of 27 years, I'm not quite really sure what to think of a lot of what I've heard so far. Let me just get one thing out of the way. There is an effort on this committee to try to hijack this important hearing about the safety of our students and the safety of the people that we are supposed to represent and assist law enforcement in protecting. Let me say it for about the millionth time. We are not going to defund the police. We're going to fund the police. And we can have the backs of our police officers and the communities in which we serve too. The communities most at risk from crime want more security, not less. We know that when you do get out and talk to them, that's why we're working to get police departments more resources, not less. And it's why we need to expand the nonprofit security grant program, which I am working on in my other committee through Homeland Security. And from what I've heard today from some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I am sure that I will be able to get many more of them to sign on to that legislation. Our number one priority has to be the reduction of violent crime. I have been saying that for over 3 decades. But let me be clear, that also includes escalating threats by extremists targeting Black Americans and Jewish Americans and Sikh Americans and others. I have to wonder, let me say this. I have worked alongside the brave men and women in blue that many of my colleagues talk about. I have seen them risk their lives over and over again to keep all, not just a few, all communities safe. And what I know from my experience is that those police officers, those rank and file officers would be extremely concerned about the safety of students and threats against students in their communities. Madam Chair, I invite my colleagues to get to truly know some of the law enforcement officers, some of the rank and file officers that they talk about and claim to know. Dr. Wilson, thank you for your leadership at Morgan, and thank you for your powerful testimony, advocating on behalf, laser focused on advocating on behalf of those students who are just trying to get an education and are dependent on us to make sure that they can. Last week, you wrote an opinion piece for Word in Black entitled HBCU Strong. Bomb threats will not deter us. Dr. Wilson, how would you say the history, because we know the history. I mean, we know it, but let's move better. Let's try to get better moving on. How would you say the history shapes the campus environment today? And I know you talked a little bit earlier, but could you talk a little bit more about how your students are handling these threats and how are you addressing the issues? And please tell me how having to now take away resources to respond to threat after threat after threat has really affected this, what should be a safe learning environment.
Thank you very much for the question, Congresswoman Dennis. Let me repeat that the psychological trauma that has been brought on by the threats is very, very severe here at Morgan and across the HBCU campuses. I do not say that in a vacuum. I certainly have been in conversations with the other HBCU presidents and chancellors, and what you see at Morgan is no different than what you will see on the other campuses where these threats have also been made. Number two, there, of course, is a long history of underfunding of these institutions. And as such, there's a reason why I said they are the innovators in American higher education, because they've had to, quote unquote, take what they had to make what they needed in order for the students, when they walked across the stage and they got those sheepskins, to be in a position to dance on the world stage with anyone, any place, anytime, anywhere. When you add the bomb threats and you add, if you will, the impact of the pandemic, and when you add all of the other things that these students have seen in a relatively short period of time, what these underfunded resource institutions must do is then to take resources from other operational areas and then shift them to the psychological, emotional well-being area. And therefore, it limits our ability to continue to advance the genre of institutions That's the way I would explain that in a relatively short period of time, Congresswoman Davis.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Wilson.
Gentlelady's time.
I yield back.
expired.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much. My pleasure to now yield to the gentlelady from California for 5 minutes, Ms. Pass.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to note that, as the ranking member said, the Republican members have left the hearing, and I think that that is emblematic of the refusal to talk about this subject. I'm saddened that in every one of their questions, they wanted to focus on crime in general, and I think you could kind of walk away saying that the real problem is actually African Americans. That's the real problem. Violence and racial violence really isn't an issue at all. And the denial of what is going on in this country and what has gone on in this country historically was certainly evident in their performance today. And I guess they don't think it's important, which is why they're not here. So let me thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. And I'm sad to say that this isn't a particularly important topic for my home city. The liberal bastion of Los Angeles actually saw the most hate crimes of any major US city over the past year, and the third highest of any US city since the 1970s. These crimes of hatred were most common against African Americans, but we also saw a large increase in hate crimes against Latinos, Asians, the LGBTQ community, Jewish Americans, and the hate and fear is not confined to any one community. Even in the Beverly Hills neighborhood, we saw homes littered with anti-Semitic flyers filled with hateful propaganda. And we really cannot stand by while hateful extremism pollutes our communities and further traumatizes our neighborhoods. We have seen anti-Semitic literature spread, not just in Beverly Hills, but throughout Los Angeles and many of the surrounding cities. I wanted to ask Mr. Kalika, and I also wanted to thank you for being a witness today in spite of what you have gone through. My district is the home to the Sikh leadership headquarters. And I wanted to know how you, when you're forced to confront anti-immigrant sentiment, religious discrimination, and related violence, how you deal with young Sikh Americans. I think in the African American community, we're used to having those conversations with our children, but I would like to know how it is for you and how young Sikh Americans are handling this.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. And early on, this is going to be the 10th anniversary of the shooting. And early on, I saw a lot of our community sort of segregate itself because of fear of being outside. Arnold Michaelis, who joined me and who was the leader of the Skinhead organization a long time ago, is now working with me. And we're in Orlando together today and going to be at the Holocaust Resource Center. But one of the things that I got approached with early on was, why do you keep bringing white people into our Sikh temple? Don't you know we're scared, we're afraid? And this was a lot of the leadership, right? And the rabbi knows this, right? And a lot of the leadership who was a little bit older said, hey, party, we're traumatized. Don't do that. Don't bring white people in here, especially don't bring white people with skinheads. And I said, listen, America's promise, we all came here for a better life. And we do have an obligation or responsibility to this country. And if I let you sit in your segregation because you're fearful, the next doctor will not happen. The next law enforcement will not happen. The next person who's about to go out and be the next congressperson will not happen. And so I think we owed it to our debt in America to make sure that we get out of we nourish the younger generation. And so that was really my motivation. That continues to be my motivation. I speak at a lot of Sikh temples all over the place, and I let them know that, hey, you know what? At this point, somebody let us know that we weren't worth being in this country.
Let me, I want to ask you another question, but before I do, let me just say that, Madam Chair, I do hope that you have another hearing where we talk about community violence. I think that that is an important topic to have, but I do want to mention that that's not the topic of this hearing. And, if we continue the attempts to deny that radical extremism, especially white supremacy, exists in our country, it's not going to move us further by just acting as though it doesn't exist. And Mr. Kalika, in your final moments, can you talk about what Congress might learn what support the federal, state, and local governments can provide to military and law enforcement to reduce their vulnerability to extremist recruitment?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. And I'll make it short. This terror affects all of us. It affects us all. And it's a community issue. It's take seriously. It's something that we need to fund. We need to get the right people doing the right job, and we need to work side by side, in hand, in tandem with law enforcement. And so I think we all need to work on this together.
Thank you. I yield because I'm out of time. Madam Chair.
The gentlelady's time has expired. And the gentleman is recognized. Mr. Fitzgerald is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Pardeep, it's as you know, I represent part of southeastern Wisconsin. I believe it was 10 years ago when that tragedy happened, and have been, I guess, monitoring the SIG community and the strides you made. I want to certainly, acknowledge that you guys have done the outreach and have done the work that I'm sure is having an impact in the community. So thank you for being here today. The one point I wanted to make, I know that a lot of issues are being raised, and this is a hearing, and that's what members of Congress are supposed to be doing, is kind of listening versus offering any solutions. And I haven't heard any real strong solutions today, other than to continue to work on these all-encompassing issues. This is not simple stuff by any means. I do want to address one thing and another item, and I would ask Dr. Penny maybe to comment on it, because it seems to be kind of this cycle that continues, and whether it is a hate crime or, for my many years in the state legislature, we had penalty enhancers that were related to crimes committed with, whether it be a handgun or some other very specific item that would change kind of the overall view of a crime. One of the issues we continue to struggle with, I think, is, in law enforcement sees it all the time, where somebody is arrested and then they're prosecuted, and then ultimately, they're back out in the street in a short period of time. And I know, listen, I have a father who was in law enforcement for 50 years and a son that was in law enforcement. And this was one of the topics that I think was most frustrating, was to just have repeat criminals that continue to be part of the system and rap sheets as long as your arm in the crimes they commit. So Dr. Penny, do you have a comment on that part of the issues we're facing?
Absolutely. Look, it is a revolving door. We're dealing with violent offenders, and look, I don't want to negate any other part of this discussion, right? I want people to understand that I am educated. I was a college professor for several years. I'm a doctor of education. I actually wrote my dissertation on mitigating the outcomes of shooting attacks on college and school campuses. So we are acknowledging that there is a situation that needs to be addressed in these communities, in these school and college campuses, as it relates to dealing with radicalized behavior. But I say that because years ago, when I approached Congress about revising CDA 230, the platform that gives these social media platforms the ability to recruit, to allow these radical groups to recruit and radicalize on their platforms, nobody wanted to revise it. Nobody wanted to appeal it. I was talking in the echo chamber. So here we are 5 years later, and people want to acknowledge that we do have a problem with social media. So if we really want to get to resolving some of these issues, we have to start there. We have to start with how our young people are being recruited and radicalized. That's number one. Number two, going back to dealing with these violent offenders, we have to address the individuals that are victimizing us in our communities. If we keep putting these people out, they're going to continue to escalate crime over and over again. These police officers are doing more work than anybody else, because they're arresting people, they're putting them in jail. These people come out, they offend other people, they commit new murders, and officers have to get out here and go find these same people all over again. We're doing double work. We have to do better. We have to do a better job. And if we can get politicians to step out of the way to allow us to do our job, we'll gladly do it.
Mr. Tatum, do you have a comment in relationship to kind of what we were just discussing?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. I think that it's invaluable for us to understand that there's not a single person that I've heard testify that will act as if there's not an issue. If someone's calling and threatening the HBCU, that is a problem. As a former law enforcement officer, I hope that they go to jail and they spend time in jail. The problem is, what is the solution to the problem? How do we get to the underlying issues? So racism just don't happen out of thin air. Prejudice and hatred towards people just don't occur out of thin air. It is bred in our society through certain mechanisms. And I believe that we do need to take a strong stance in making sure law enforcement officers are able to arrest people who are radicalized, who hate white people, who hate Black people, who hate Jewish people, and put them in jail and they stay there. The problem is that we, in our society, we have focused more on caring for the suspects than we do the victims. Rehabilitation is a thing that we need to address. However, these individuals need to go to jail and they need to stay in jail instead of getting out and perpetuating more and more crimes. We need to funding for technology and innovation for law enforcement officers to be able to catch individuals who are causing these bomb threats.
Gentleman's time is up. The gentleman's time is up.
Madam Chair.
Thank you so very much. Gentleman's time has expired. It is my pleasure now to recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Congresswoman McBath, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lee, and thank you so much for holding this very critical and important issue today. And I'd also like to thank our witnesses for joining us to share your stories and also to shed more light on this crisis. But I just have to say it's important that we're absolutely clear about what this hearing is about today. Domestic terror, no matter the source, no matter the target, is inconsistent with the principles of liberty and equality on which our great nation was founded. And, I know that our Republican colleagues have been talking about other problems today, both real and imagined, and that simply just distracts from a real problem that deserves our full attention today. And as an alumna of Virginia State University, graduating from a historically Black university has been one of my greatest honors of my lifetime. There, I not only earned an excellent education, I also grew up as a woman, as a person. I found a sisterhood in Delta Sigma Theta sorority and took part in one of the greatest educational opportunities afforded me in preparation for my work as a member of Congress. Historically, Black colleges and universities, along with other minority institutions, have been the bedrock of higher education for millions of Americans of color for almost 200 years. And they have offered Americans opportunities and futures when so many other doors were shut. These recent bomb threats to HBCUs are not just a threat to the African-American community, they're also a threat to the academic and economic futures of Americans, African-Americans. In my home state of Georgia, 3 institutions have received bomb threats in recent weeks. These include Spelman College, Fort Valley State University, and Albany State University. These hate crimes are meant to disrupt the stability and permanence of HBCUs, but these attempts to intimidate us, they're not going to succeed. HBCU graduates like myself, students and communities, we will continue to thrive and continue to flourish as we have almost done for 2 centuries. So I thank the FBI investigators for taking these threats so seriously. These are threats that are racially motivated, they're violent extremism, and they're hate crimes. And I call on them to ensure that these investigations are thoroughly and comprehensively completed. Dr. Wilson, last week you wrote an opinion piece for Word and Black titled HBCU Strong, Bomb Threat Will Never Deter Us. You wrote, and I quote, "Those founders knew that the journey laid before them would be a rough one. The terrain arduous and rugged, the rivers deep and unrelenting. Moreover, they fully recognized that they were putting their very lives on line as they marched for, fought for, and sadly, for many died for the right to live free and to create institutions that would educate their sons and daughters. Can you put into context for us the recent series of bomb threats against HBCUs in the broader story of racism and hate-based violence against African Americans in this country?
Congresswoman Macbeth, this is just a continuation of that struggle that you so eloquently outlined. Of course, what we have as a connective tissue amongst all of the HBCUs is the way that we were birthed, whether it's Morehouse or Tuskegee or Hampton or Morgan or Prairie View. It's almost the same kind of story. And so what I was saying to the university community, indeed to the nation, that if you were to look just at Morgan, one of our visionary founders was the late Reverend Samuel Green, who is depicted in the movie Harriet. And he was born a slave in Dorchester County, and it was against the law to learn how to read and write. But his owner basically taught him to read and write. And then there was a Fugitive Slave Act in existence that said, okay, but if you are north of the Mason-Dixon line and you're caught, then you could be returned to your owner or you could be jailed. Well, he was caught beyond the Mason-Dixon line, and he was sentenced to 10 years in a Baltimore City penitentiary. He served 5 years. And when he came out in 1862, he basically had more desire to found institutions that would be about creating literacy, for those sons and daughters that were about to be freed. And so our students and the faculty and staff and alumni here at Morgan and across the HBCU space, we have to understand this resilience, and we have to understand that we really are about simply saying to our great country, we are not a truly functioning democracy if, for example, our laws and practices are designed to marginalize and keep everyone from fully participating. And our ancestors knew that, and they fought so hard to enable our Constitution to live up to those ideals. And so we try and motivate and inspire in spite of the challenges that are brought on by the struggle.
Thank you so much, and I'm out of time. I yield back.
Lay's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Tiffany for 5 minutes. Mr. Tiffany?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to yield my time to Representative Biggs from Arizona.
Your time is now yielded to Mr. Biggs. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Biggs? You've been yielded to by Mr. Tiffany for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I was talking away without unmuting, Madam Chair.
All right.
That just happens now and then on these Zoom issues. So I apologize for that. And I was saying that I appreciate the testimony of the witnesses. I appreciate we have covered a broad spectrum of things. I did find it interesting that some of the concerns people have mentioned have been characterized as real and imagined. I thought that was interesting because I think everybody here is sincere and attempting to try to resolve issues that I think are important. But one of the things, Rabbi, you mentioned, and I have to say, Mr. Kalika, you mentioned it, Mr. Jones mentioned it, and Dr. Wilson, President Wilson, all mentioned this notion of speaking and communicating and trying to resolve some issues by how we communicate with each other and get to the bottom of these things. And I thought it was an inflammatory statement that somebody made saying that Republicans are trying to hijack this committee hearing. I don't think that's the case at all. I think what we're trying to do is the same thing that I believe in all sincerity that the witnesses are trying to do and my colleagues on the other side, and that's to move the ball forward and try to find solutions to violence, whether it be race-based violence at historically black college and universities, whether it be anti-Semitic violence or anti-Sikh or any other kind of group. And I mentioned my denomination, its period of victimization. And I think this is really critical. I hope that we're not spending our time talking past each other. I hope that we're talking to each other and communicating and understanding with sincere hearts what's being said today. And so I want to talk about one of the suggestions that was made by Dr. Penny, and it was echoed as well by Mr. Tatum. And it goes like this, Section 230. So we talk about radicalization, because radicalization, if we're going to resolve some of these issues, we have to get to how are people, particularly young people, being radicalized, and why they would view themselves as inside and view others as outside and attack them for whatever reason. But you mentioned Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And what role do you think that these platforms are playing, Dr. Penny and Mr. Tatum, in the radicalization of people who then do things like plant bombs, or not in this case, not plant bombs, but seek to terrorize historically black colleges and universities because for whatever reason. But maybe it's hate. I don't know. We're still investigating, but I got to know what you think Section 230, how that impacts something like that, Dr. Penny.
Absolutely. I think it's important for people to understand what Section 230 is. Basically, what it is it's a policy that essentially shields these social media companies from liability, from what a third party posts on their platform. So let's remember now, this Communication Decency Act was passed back in 1996. We're in 2022. So there are some real issues that need to be addressed. And these social media platforms, they understand that. They use it to their ability to allow these radical groups. And a lot of this content is being, whether you want to, look, that's a whole nother issue where we want to talk about it or not, but we're being influenced by foreign entities. They know the difference between rubles being paid on their platforms and United States currency. They know the difference, but they're not saying anything. They're allowing individuals to fund rhetoric and content in our community, in our country, that's being used to incite our people to violence. And look, just for clarification, guys, I'm from I went to a HBCU university, right? I'm from the Black community. I love people. I'm a member of a prominent Jewish organization. I'm a member of a prominent African-American organization. The issues that our Democrat colleagues are throwing out there, there is no agenda here. Guys, we're trying to get to a real solution and how we can fix problems in this country. The bottom line is force and intimidation that used for the purposes of changing governmental policy.
The gentleman's time is expired. The gentleman's time is expired. Thank you so very much. It's my pleasure to now yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, for 5 minutes. Congresswoman Dean, for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Also, thank you to all of the folks here who have offered us your testimony, your expertise, your personal experience. In particular, Mr. Kalika, I offer my family's sympathy to your families. Rabbi Crichton Walker, we're so thankful that you're here, that you are anywhere, and extraordinary the circumstances that you and your congregation had to endure. I've been thinking about this. I'm a former college professor. I taught writing and rhetoric and ethics. So I loved that many of you used the expression that I used too often in my class. Words matter. Our words matter. So let me associate myself first with the words of Representatives Bass and Demings and McBath. Our words matter as we ask questions, as we pull information out that we might be able to benefit from in this important hearing. So I'm going to try to get to, in my limited time, two different things. Ms. Hong, I want to get to the why. if you don't mind, why do you believe in Southern Poverty Law Center? What does the data show us? Why do we have an increase in domestic violent extremism in our country? If you could briefly give us a little kernel about that.
Thank you, Congresswoman Dean. I think what you stated is really important, that the framing of talking about crime is completely different than talking about domestic terrorism. It's not fair to ask first responders to crime to deal with the problems of extremism and domestic terrorism. It's not safe for us to ask them to do that. This requires a multi-pronged response. And to your question, why we're seeing the rise and influence of these extremist groups, I think there's a few reasons. First, it is increasingly being mainstreamed into our political discourse. We've seen references to extremist views. We've seen calls to extremist organizations from high-profile members of the former administration, as well as from members of Congress. And that gives supporters, advocates, believers, adherents to these ideologies the encouragement to act on these beliefs. The second, I agree with my colleagues who've cited the importance of social media. There's no question that many people are learning about extremist ideologies online, but we need to do much more research to understand why being exposed to those ideologies online is actually encouraging more and more people to take action. And unfortunately, we don't have enough research at this time.
Thank you for both of those answers. And in my limited time left, I want to call upon both Dr. Wilson and Rabbi Crichton Walker to turn to the how. How do we get to healing? I'm certain that one of the ways is through education. I'm reminded of the words of Eboo Patel, who said, "It matters who gets to a young person's microphone first. Who do they hear from first?" So how do we get to healing, Dr. Wilson and Rabbi Crichton Walker?
I would just be very brief. I think you started down the right path. It is through education. And I would be disingenuous if I did not say that I'm very alarmed by what I see happening with state legislatures and school districts across the country with regard to removing books and sanitizing curricula. That's not the way you're going to solve this problem, if you will. And then I think for what I'm seeing across the campuses, I do think that perhaps some additional resources may be coming through Health and Human Services to enable us to minister to the psychological and emotional well-being of our community. Certainly would be welcomed as well.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time is up. I'm pleased to recognize the gentlelady
Oh,
from...
I had a little time left. I was hoping to hear from the rabbi. Maybe I don't.
You do.
Oh, then, sorry, my apologies.
I moved too quickly. Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you, Representative. And so just briefly, I would say that with regard to healing means that something bad has already happened and that we need to heal from, right? And so all that love and support that we have gotten from people from every background, and it matters. It really helps. And I would hope that the HBCUs, that anyone who deals, the Sikh community, that anyone who deals with trauma and terror is able to receive that love and support. And part of what we need to do is to show that love and support before something bad happens, right? To really care for not just our own community, but other communities as well. Those are key. That's key. It's something that's hard to legislate, but that's something that's incumbent upon each of us.
I thank you. Beautifully said. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
And thank you for your understanding. If they needed to speak a little bit longer, I indulge you on that. But thank you so very much for your questioning. And it's my pleasure now to yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon, for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee, for calling this timely and very important hearing. You know, the data we have shows that incidents of domestic terrorism and extremism and hate-based violence are all on the rise. And while some may seek to deflect attention from this hate-fueled violence by terming it identity politics, We must recognize that these incidents occur when extremists target individuals based upon their identities, seeking to divide our communities by sowing hate and chaos. My district is a reflection of the diverse melting pot that is America. 25% of my constituents are Black, 7% are Asian, and 4% Hispanic. More than 12% are foreign born. Unfortunately, our community has also seen the recent rise in extremist violence targeting racial and religious minorities. According to the Philadelphia Anti-Defamation League, 2020 was the third highest year on record for anti-Semitic incidents in Pennsylvania, including vandalism of a Philadelphia synagogue and online verbal and physical harassment of Jewish community members in my region. There's a large Sikh population in my district, and in visiting at the Gurdwara and meeting with community members, I know they are frequently harassed and confronted with anti-immigrant sentiment, religious discrimination, and hate-based violence. And as bomb threats have targeted over 20 historically Black colleges and universities in recent weeks, we've been concerned for the students and faculty at Cheney University, the nation's first HBCU here in my district. So I'm really grateful to our witnesses for being here today and eager to hear more about the ways in which the federal government can better support institutions facing threats, as well as preventing incidents of domestic terrorism in the first place. So Dr. Jones, the CSIS report from April 12, 2021 indicated that 66% of terrorist plots and attacks in the United States were committed by white supremacists, extremist militia members, and other far-right extremists. How does that volume and focus of right-wing extremist activity compare to prior years?
It's actually similar in many ways to the percentages from recent years. We continue to see the majority of violence of domestic terrorism that is perpetrated by white supremacists and anti-government militias. We do see in our data set domestic terrorism perpetrated by anti-fascists and others, but the highest percentages continue to be those perpetrated by white supremacists. I should also add, in addition to attacks and plots, the highest levels of fatalities are also committed by those on the white supremacist side.
Thank you. Ms. Huang, how are disinformation, false narratives, and conspiracy theories used to recruit new members, and what can we do about that?
Thank you, Congresswoman Scanlon. One of the most important things we have to do is to focus on prevention initiatives. We need to be making investments in education and ensuring that schools can teach inclusive history, not just the good parts of American history, but all of our history. And that enables us to have conversations about the types of experiences we've had in the past with slavery, with genocide, with other problems of white supremacy, so that it's not some kind of hidden or opaque myth. The other thing that's really important to do is to focus on investing in preventative and resilient measures. Some of my colleagues on the panel have talked about this. There are calls for increased funding for security reasons. The Nonprofit Security Fund, for example, is important, but it has to be complemented with efforts to educate and build resilience in communities to stop radicalization. And we've worked with the Peril Lab at American University to put out some guidance for parents and families on how they can look out for possible radicalization amongst young people and take steps to stop that when it's identified. So we'd like to see more investments concomitant with that. And of course, Congresswoman Lee's legislation that she's introduced, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, would be a terrific help.
Thank you. Mr. Kalika, you've worked some in this field, as I understand it, to counter hate and promote understanding. You've worked with de-radicalization, helping families respond when loved ones become involved in extremist groups or when they want to move away. Can you talk about what you think, what lessons Congress can learn from your de-radicalization efforts?
Yeah, thank you so much, Congresswoman. Yeah, I think just what we're trying to do is attempt to scale what we're doing. And scaling it means that we need to teach people how to create a counseling subspecialty around terrorism. What are some of the indicators that we look at? What are ways that we can change behavior as it goes forward? And while I can't comment on cases, I can let you know that we're seeing a rise in domestic terrorism cases on our end as well.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I see my time has expired, but I would request unanimous consent to enter into the record a report from the Philadelphia Anti-Defamation League titled 2020 Third Highest Year on Record for Anti-Semitic Incidents in Pennsylvania.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentlelady's time has expired. We know that our rabbi has to log out of this virtual in a short order, and I'm trying to make sure that all of our remaining members are able to have him present when they speak. So, Mr. Cicilline, you are now recognized for 5 minutes, and we have 2 other members. Rabbi, thank you for your generous time. Ms. Cicilline for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this really important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses. Domestic terrorism, widely fueled by white supremacy, is one of the greatest threats to our country's safety and security. And we have seen over the past decade, Black Americans senselessly murdered at Emanuel AME Church, increased threats against HBCUs, Jews murdered in Poway, California, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and now taken hostage in Texas, Hispanic people targeted in El Paso, and a shooting that left 23 innocent people dead, and a deranged gunman going on a killing spree across 3 massage parlors targeting Asian women in Georgia, and too many other violent hate crimes irrevocably harming minority communities. And yet, instead of these attacks spurring action to confront the threat of white supremacy and hate groups and the threats that they pose, these organizations have actually grown, and so has domestic terrorism. 2020 saw the highest rates of domestic terrorism since data started being collected more than 25 years ago. And white supremacists or far-right extremist groups were responsible for 2/3 of terror plots and attacks in the United States that year. And sadly, I'm going to join my colleagues, Congresswoman Bass, Congresswoman Demings, and others who have made the point that instead of focusing on this very real threat, some of our Republican colleagues have tried to use this hearing as a campaign forum to promote the false claim that Democrats are against funding the police. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. That is not the position of the Democratic Party. And in fact, when we had the opportunity to test that, we funded the police to the tune of $350 billion in the American CARES Act that was eligible for law enforcement to use, local law enforcement. Every single Republican in Congress voted no to that funding for law enforcement. So let's put that nonsense aside and focus on the hearing before us today in this very real issue. And my first question is for you, Dr. Jones. Can you just speak to how disinformation and false narratives and conspiracy theories really are used to recruit new members to extremist groups, and what you think is the status of the government's efforts to disrupt online disinformation and recruitment by extremist groups, and is what the government doing to disrupt that working?
Yeah, thanks for the great question. Disinformation happens in at least 2 major ways. One is primarily disinformation caused by domestic organizations in the US or extremist groups operating overseas. What we see is false information about immigrants, numbers of immigrants, about activity being pursued by racial or ethnic communities. And the entire use of disinformation is designed to energize individuals, to affect emotions in ways that they A, radicalize, and then B, act on that eventually. The second area we have seen is some activity by foreign actors, particularly some of Russia's intelligence services, the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, as well as Russia's GRU, the main intelligence directorate, attempting to exploit, using disinformation and online platforms inside of the United States, using disinformation to also exploit polarization, ethnic, racial, and other divisions. So we've seen both domestic actors doing it as well as foreign. As to whether Congress and the government have done enough, I will say that there has been an uptick in my conversations with some of the Joint Terrorism Task Forces and the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to pay more attention to this. We are way behind the 8 ball for where we were on the Salafi jihadist side, the monitoring Islamic State.
I'm going to try to get a couple more questions, so I don't want to cut you off, but we have a lot of
we're
work to do.
behind.
Yeah.
We're
So
behind,
I'm gonna
yeah.
ask these last two questions, and then I'm gonna ask the witnesses to answer them so I can get them both in. One is, Ms. Hang, first of all, thank you for the incredible work you do and your organization does. What would you like to see more done to help people actually move away from extremism and to prevent this violence? And how can the federal government support these efforts? Because it's almost like deprogramming people who have joined gangs. Like, what do we need to do? And Rabbi, thank you for your beautiful testimony and for your heroism and for the humanity which you brought to this hearing. I wondered if you'd speak a little bit about the challenges of leading a congregation bearing the burden of generational trauma and the residual anxiety that comes from that, and what that has meant for your congregation and for you as a rabbi.
Gentleman has
And the chair will
10
not,
seconds.
I'm sure, interrupt the rabbi or Ms. Wang as they answer that question.
Thank you, Congressman Cicilline. Is it all right, Congresswoman Jackson-Lee, to go ahead?
You may proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to emphasize, I think it's critically important to note that the balance of domestic extremism that we're seeing right now really is being led by the focus on white supremacy. And that means that some of the steps that have to be taken address white supremacy directly. It is not just the Southern Poverty Law Center who's noted this. We've heard this from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security in their strategic intelligence assessment. The view of FBI Director Wray and DHS Secretary Mayorkas in their congressional testimony last September. All of these government agencies have lifted up the importance of focusing on white supremacy, which means that we need to look at these underlying causes, including steps like Congresswoman Jackson-Lee's HR 40 bill, which would commission a study of reparations for slavery, enabling us to look at the underlying history in this country of white supremacy and how has it affected different groups. It's just one example, but I want to be mindful of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me ask the rabbi to remember my dear friend, Mr. Cicilline's question, and let me allow Mr. Liu to go forward. And then if you can incorporate your answer, you're so valuable, all of you, and we'd like to get Mr. Liu and Mr. Cohen in before you have to do your duties, Rabbi. Thank you for your graciousness. Mr. Liu, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, for holding this very important hearing. First, I'd like to do is to ask unanimous consent to enter 2 documents for the record. The first is the Congressional Bipartisan HBCU Caucus Letter to Attorney General Garland and FBI Director Wray, dated February 4th, 2022. And the second is the American Council on Education Letter to congressional leaders regarding the bomb threats, dated February 14th, 2022.
Without objection, so ordered.
And now I would like to read a statement from my friend and colleague, Congresswoman Alma Adams, who's a co-chair of the Congressional HBCU Caucus. She says, I prayed for our beloved HBCUs this past week. However, as a proud alum twice of North Carolina A&T State University, as a former professor at Bennett College, and as a founder and co-chair of the Congressional Bipartisan HBCU Caucus, I know for a fact HBCUs can overcome any challenge. However, HBCUs shouldn't have to face the violence and terror my generation experienced during segregation. Terrorism and racism have no place in college campuses or anywhere else. Congresswoman Adams continues, I also want to take this opportunity to address the perpetrators of these crimes. Just as I have prayed for our HBCUs, I am praying for you. I am praying that you learn from the pain you've caused. I am praying that the hate that inspired these acts leaves your heart forever. Like many others around the world, I owe our HBCUs a debt that can never be repaid. That is why I continue to pray for our institutions and the souls of those who cannot or will not honor them. And Congresswoman Adams concludes, in the wake of more threats levied against Spelman College, Howard University, and Winston-Salem State University in the past weeks, our nation is being forced to once again reckon with our history of racism and discrimination. Now is the time to respond as a nation, as a Congress, and as individuals. Such threats of violence must be stopped. At this point, I have some questions for President Wilson. President Wilson, has the FBI updated you about their investigation of these bomb threats?
As much as I can say in this in this format. We are in communication with the FBI and with the Department of Homeland Security. Our chief of police is in continuous conversation with them.
And has the FBI or local law enforcement advised you on what HBCUs are supposed to do when you get future bomb threats?
Resources have been made available to us from the FBI in terms of possible training opportunities, which of course we welcome. We have a law enforcement and armed law enforcement a contingent here of pretty close to 60 members. That's our authorization. And so certainly any training opportunities that can come our way, we would welcome them, Congressman. Of course, we just don't want any more bomb threats. I mean, I think that's the bottom line, is that I think the fragility of our campus is quite alarming. And I hate to even talk about just preparing the university, for more threats and who knows what else. But that's the sad reality.
Great. Thank you. Rabbi Citron Walker, I'm going to give you the opportunity to answer the question from my colleague, David Cicilline. I also have a question for you as well. I've been working with Congressman Colin Allred on the nonprofit security grants that you mentioned earlier. We're trying to increase funding. My question to you is, are there things for which you would like that grant to apply to, for which it currently does not? In other words, are there places you think we should expand the applicability of these grants? And with that, I'll yield and let you answer those two questions, one from David Cicilline and one from me.
Regarding the grants, yes, to expand it. I don't know the details enough or the specifics. I'm not that policy expert, but I do know that there was testimony given by the Eric Fingerhut of Congressman Fingerhut of Jewish Federations, and Michael Masters from SCAN, the Secure Communities Network, that I believe would help address how it can be expanded, not just in terms of funding. We certainly want support for smaller congregations. That is one thing I can certainly speak to. Smaller congregations don't have the resources to write out the grants and do that work. So we need support as far as that goes. Regarding the representative's question about generational trauma, if I believe that is correct, and just how do we heal? I would say that the way that I've been taking it is one day at a time. We need to address our security concerns. We also need to be able to move past this incident. We are trying to celebrate as a community and rejoice as a community. And when people need those hugs, when it's fewer people are seeing me and bursting into tears, fewer people are hearing my voice for the first time and choking up, which is a good thing. I'm a huge fan of, and I've been preaching a lot about taking advantage of mental health resources. We need to have that sense of support, and we need to be able to celebrate. And so I don't know how much more I could offer there, but our therapists are telling us that as soon as we can get back to normal, that's a positive thing.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. And thank you for those questions. Thank you. Very quickly, Rabbi, let me yield to our dear friend from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes. Mr. Cohen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Been rather hectic here. I've got a tax town hall in a few minutes, but I did want to address a few things that I wanted to speak earlier, and I think you more or less addressed them. And I think all of our members have the same problem. This is a serious issue, and it's great that you had this hearing, and the witnesses have been marvelous. They've all been marvelous. The Rabbi, you're a hero. You spent that time, didn't know with your other members of the congregation whether you're going to live or not. And y'all did great, and you were heroic, and I thank you. I don't know if you know Rabbi Greenstein, but if you do, you're a Rabbi Greenstein. You'll know that's an honor. the Republicans all talked about some people on this committee. It's what Big said. And what Mr. Burgess said was that members of this committee, plural, have talked about defund the police. I know of only one member on this committee who might have talked about defunding the police. And I wanted to ask them to name the members they're talking about so the members could tell them, yes, you're right, or no, you're not. They're not with us. So I can say, with the exception of one person, the Democrats have not called on defund the police.
Madam Chair, I am here if he wishes to ask me a question.
Who were you mentioning? You said some members have said defund the police on this committee. Who were you addressing, sir?
Yeah, first of all, Chairman Nadler agreed that the New York Police Department budget should be cut, stating, quote, there should be substantial cuts to the
Sir,
police
the only
budget.
question I have for you is who said defund the police?
I'm reading to you what he said exactly.
He didn't say defund the police, did he?
Is that your best defense, Mr. Cohen? Okay, all right. I can go for, I can give you, okay, I'll just go Chairman Nadler, Representative Bush, Representative Mondaire Jones, Representative Hakeem Jeffries. I'll give you Hakeem Jeffries because he was more equivocal, and Representative Jayapal. I've got their statements. I've got their references to those statements. I'm happy to submit those to the record, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the gentleman's question.
Thank you,
And I'll
Mr.
yield
Biggs.
back.
Madam Chairman, how many of those members are on the subcommittee? Is Ms. Bush on the subcommittee and Mr. Nadler?
Are you posing a question? Those are members of the subcommittee. Mr. Nadler is a member of all subcommittees.
Yeah, but other than that, Ms. Bush is the only one he mentioned that was on the subcommittee.
That is my understanding.
So Ms. Bush isn't here to say, and I think she probably has said defund the police. I don't think Mr. Nadler has. And the other people, I can't speak to them, but they weren't on the subcommittee. Bottom line is, most, if not 90% of the Democrats, or 95%, have never talked about defund the police. I'm a former Memphis police legal advisor. I've advocated for strong policing. We had in our American Recovery Act $350 billion that could be used by police. No Republican voted for it. $350 billion that only Democrats voted for, giving police, local governments the opportunity to hire more policemen, to fund policemen, and to improve their systems. We are for the common defense, for police protection, and have funded it with so we've walked the walk, not just talked the talk. There are problems, but there are problems indeed on the hearing matter has been called the hate in this country, the terrorism, mostly from the radical white supremacists, is horrific. It's un-American. It's inhuman. It's wrong. It's been synagogues. It's been churches. It's been NAACP headquarters. When I was a child, I remember the Atlanta synagogue being bombed. I'll never forget such. In Birmingham, it was the church, I think it was the 16th Street Church, bombed. African Americans and Jews have suffered the most hate in this country. Sikhs are suffering it now, Muslims and Arabs too. It must stop. Now, indeed, in Tennessee, a man just pled guilty to bombing 4 white Protestant churches. So the right wing sometimes goes off and they even destroy or deface religious institutions that are akin to their own if they have a religion. These people might just be worshiping Satan. Thank you for our witnesses. Thank you for our chair. The truth will win out, and we need to shine a light on it. That's what Ida B. Wells told us and shared with us, that the best disinfectant is the truth, and we should speak the truth. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman from Memphis and thank him for his intensity. His time has been yielded and now expired. Let me yield to Mr. Biggs if he has any additional comments that he chooses to make at this time, the ranking member.
Madam Chair, thank you. Again, thank you. I thank the witnesses for being here. This has been actually a very, in my mind, a very productive and very enlightening hearing, and I appreciate your leadership on this issue, and I appreciate all the witnesses that have testified. I've got a comment just a little bit to the gentleman from Tennessee, and also the gentleman from Rhode Island who said that that it was the Republicans are defunding the police. I'll just tell you that I'm going to submit for the record, Madam Chair, an article of July 7th, 2021 that debunks what the gentleman from Rhode Island said. In fact, that claim that he made got 3 Pinocchios in the Washington Post. So I'll submit that to you. And then I'll also submit, Madam Chair, if possible, without objection, the citations for the individuals on our committee, not our subcommittee. I didn't say our subcommittee. I said our committee, which is the Judiciary Committee. I'll submit those to you as well, the statement, so we can all see the statements that they made. Now, I want to talk.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. I want to get to really what I think has been just some remarkable testimony that we have to get to, and I appreciate I'm sorry. I've got to clarify one other thing. We had most of our members were on this committee, who are on the subcommittee, were in attendance one time or another. Some of them actually have conflicting subcommittees or committee hearings while we speak, so they weren't all able to be with us the entire time. But I thought Dr. Jones' testimony was particularly insightful because it substantiated a lot of what Dr. Penny had said about not just domestic actors participating in indoctrination and radicalization of American actors, but there was also foreign actors participating there. That's a terrible thing, and we need to do better. And Section 230 is, in my opinion, is just part of the way we get that. And I've been working on that for the last 2 years, just so everyone can know. And I think my friend from Rhode Island is actually working on big tech issues as well. And I think those would deal with radicalization as much as the additional censorship. And I appreciate his efforts on some of that in that area as well. I wanted to tell Dr. Wilson, I really appreciate his testimony. I thought it was very clarifying and very important and very substantive as well. And I appreciate that testimony. I also want to thank Brandon Tatum, who testified. As an alumni myself of the U of A Law School and a native of Arizona, I remember Brandon playing, Mr. Tatum playing on the University of Arizona Wildcat football team, which was enjoying better times when he played than it is enjoying today. And so I appreciate you being here and testifying today. And I express to the rabbi and also to Mr. Kalika, a heartfelt, condolences and sympathy to what you've endured and appreciate it. And Madam Chair, I could go on because I do think this is a very important topic. I've written it down, additional notes to go from, and I will take much, having learned much today. And I thank you, and I yield back to you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, I have a unanimous consent request.
Mrs. Cicilline, you're recognized for unanimous
Thank you,
consent.
Madam Chair. I'd ask that a statement from the Sikh Coalition regarding increased violence against their community be made a part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Let me, first of all, thank Mr. Ranking Member Biggs for putting on the record the importance of this hearing. And I prayerfully hope that he has gained additional insight. And I am very grateful that he has acknowledged his own faith, and he is right. I would say to you, Mr. Biggs, many of my friends are in your faith, and I have known the discrimination historically and even present that has impacted your community. So I think your acceptance and insight of the importance of this is crucial, because that's the only way we can move forward in a bipartisan way. So I want to restate just for a few minutes, this hearing's topic was a rise in violence against minority institutions. But we are grateful that we have heard what words can do. We see with Mr. Kalaka, he tragically lost friends, fellow worshipers, and most his loving father. Someone died, persons died. And I've known the Sikh community. They are very strong in Houston. We are close. People died. And so I appreciate your presence here today. Dr. Jones, your statistics are going to be very helpful in moving forward on the domestic terrorism legislation, because it is shocking to many of us that the federal government does not have a greater presence in data collection, prosecution, because people die. And I think that is what this hearing should suggest. Out of these words and actions, out of the tiki torches in Charlottesville, Virginia, someone died. Out of the anti-Semitic remarks, synagogues across the nation have had people die. And how grateful we are that in Colleyville, lives were saved, even though the perpetrator said Jews control the world, a greatly anti-Semitic statement. People died. Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for digging into the deep generational trauma that our young Black students face. And I'll have a question for you very briefly and a question for Ms. Wan. And again, we hug and honor. We mourn, hug, and honor. We honor and hug Rabbi because he lived. And those in that synagogue lived that were under threat. Tragedy, of course, that out of threats, some violence comes and people die. That is the cruciality of this hearing. That is the topic that should not be diminished. People die. And the pain that I have and that my members have, this Congress should have, the nation should have, is that across the nation of HBCUs, presidents are charged with academic responsibility, but they are not FBI, they are not law enforcement, they are not national security experts, and we are telling our presidents of Black universities and other universities of color that they now have to take on another responsibility because children could die. I cannot leave this hearing without making that point. So let me, first of all, go to Ms. Hahn for the storied history of the Southern Party Leadership Conference, and to thank you for now your new leadership, which I'm so proud of. But can you respond to my point? And again, you are right, HR 40 that is now ready to pass this Congress or to become law is that very important response to stopping for a moment to discern racism and its deeply embedded core as it relates to African Americans, the descendants of enslaved Africans. We are ready for that bill. But could you, in your history of the Southern Poverty Leadership, tie words to ultimate killings and violence? That seems to be missed. And I want that to be clear on the record. Ms. Swan.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Jackson Lee. I believe you know that every year the Southern Poverty Law Center issues a Year in Hate report. And in that report, we track the activities of more than 1,200 hate and extremist groups across the country, many of whom, and increasingly many of whom, embrace white supremacy as their leading ideology. There's no question that we cannot successfully tackle domestic terrorism without dealing with the problem of white supremacy in this country. The efforts right now that we're seeing to discourage teachers and schools from talking about our honest history are contributing to this narrative that white supremacy is not the problem, and it is. We've seen that time and time again from the data that is collected by the government and from the activities of the groups that we track and monitor. I would just add, what's most important is that over the long term, we have to focus on anti-bias, anti-hate prevention, and civic engagement initiatives. This is how we're going to counter domestic terrorism. It is the fourth pillar of the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism that was put out by the White House and this Biden administration. And we hope that this committee and Congress will take those recommendations very seriously and prioritize addressing white supremacy as the key to addressing all of these problems. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you. Just out of those words, have you documented that people die? Words and actions that you've just evidenced.
We have seen time and time again that people die because of white supremacy, because of hate and extremism in this country. And it's why we have spent so much of our time and energy trying to document these ideologies and to give warning and support to communities who want to stand up and protect themselves.
I thank you very much. Dr. Morgan, as an academician and the president of the university representing the world of HBCUs and Thurgood Marshall schools, coming from your historic history, which in this day and time is important for people to know that there is that history. Do you, in your leadership and your ability to give strength to your students, but do you have as your trepidation, your history, that when anger and hateful comments were made, people died?
Unfortunately, that is a part of the great history of the formation and survival of HBCUs. I have documented in my testimony, going back to 1865, how acts of racism have destroyed buildings on the campuses, have led to deaths of students and deaths of professors. And Madam Chair, based on what you just heard from Margaret Wong of the Southern Poverty Law Center, it is really that connected with your comment that keeps me up at night and keeps other HBCU presidents and chancellors up at night. We just are in a period, where we don't know if one of these threats will no longer just simply be a threat. And that is a very, very frightening place to be. Our students who come to Morgan and to other HBCUs, they come to get an education. They come to prepare themselves for the future of work and the work of the future. They just want to have an education in an environment where their very lives are not being threatened every day. And there is no other genre of institutions that I'm aware of, as I have raised my hand in this hearing today, that is receiving the bomb threats with the kind of regularity that we see across HBCUs. I hope the nation wakes up and responds in a way that will bring this to an end. And I appreciate the opportunity, Madam Chair, for having presented before this subcommittee today.
Dr. Wilson, thank you. Thank you to, as well, I don't think I mentioned Dr. Penny and Dr. Tatum. Thank you to all the other witnesses, which I did express my appreciation. Dr. Wilson, let it be clear that this committee, this Congress, and this nation will be standing with you. I wish to introduce into the record the series of texts that are now appearing in the trial of the Mike Michaels. One to read, referring to Black people. They ruin everything. That's why I love what I do now. Not a N-I-G-G-E-R in sight. Mike Michaels said in the message. There's a series of these that are prevalent in the testimony. I want to ask unanimous consent to include these in the record, which I will do without objection. And then I want to introduce into the record a letter that was sent by Chairman Nadler, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, Chairwoman Beatty, to the FBI in sync, Dr. Wilson, and with all of the witnesses for there to be a full briefing of this committee and of course the Congressional Black Caucus on the question of the attacks on historically Black colleges and of course the rise in racism and anti-Semitism among many other groups. But we're insisting, let me put that on the record. I want to ensure Director Ray to know that we will be in touch and want this to be immediate and not later, because in order for Congress to act, we must have these kinds of serious briefings. And so that letter will be put into the record as well. As I conclude, let me say to my own city of Houston, we are in this fight together. Let me thank Chief Finner, Mayor Sylvester Turner, for the hard work that is going on, that I am joining them in, and the many neighbors that are standing up against crime, but the many victims who have been victimized by crime. We do not take it lightly, and we are equal to cities across the nation. We're coming into a period that mixes the toxicity of the pandemic and the toxicity of the divisive language that was evidenced on January 6th and in the past years. We now have to overcome that with healing and coming together, and yes, legislation like HR 40. I think this hearing has emphasized the importance of the work that the committee is doing, and we will look forward to hearings addressing the question of violence forthcoming, because that's what we do in the Judiciary Committee. We take up the issues of concern. I want to finally say that members on this committee have the right to have differing opinions and characterize their own words. And I'm sure that all members appreciate the good work of our law enforcement officers that are protecting us across the nation. With that, this concludes today's hearing. I thank all of you and our distinguished witnesses for attending. We mourn those who have lost loved ones, and we commit ourselves to finding solutions. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you very much.